Welcome back to the journey through time. Whether you're relaxing in bed or just need some company, I'm glad you're here. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Feel free to drop a comment. I always find it fascinating to know your words. If these slow narratives offer you comfort and rest, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe. Now, let's begin the story. Puca, the Shadow and the Hearth. The unfurling of a secret. The peat fire in the hearth of old Maeve's cottage did not crackle with the same youthful exuberance of a timber blaze. Instead, it smoldered, a deep, glowing heart of compressed earth and time, painting the single room in hues of amber and dancing shadow. The air itself was thick with the scent of burning turf, a fragrance comparable to the very soil of Ireland after a soft rain, mixed with the pungent aroma of drying herbs hanging from the low, smoke-blackened rafters. To young Finn, perched on a three-legged stool too low for his lanky frame, the atmosphere felt heavy, not just with smoke, but with the weight of the tale his grandmother was about to weave. Maeve's voice, a dry rustle reminiscent of autumn leaves skittering across stone, began to fill the spaces between the pops of the fire. There are stories, Astorine, that are not written in the books the monks keep. They are written in the wind that whispers through the firs, in the patterns of frost on a winter pane, and in the silence that falls between the barks of a fox. They are the stories of the old things, the ones who were here before the first stone of the first wrath was laid. Finn leaned forward, his elbows digging into his knees. He was 12 summers old, his face a constellation of freckles beneath a thatch of unruly red hair. The world outside the cottage was the known world, the rolling, sheep-dotted hills of County Kerry, the relentless Atlantic wind, and the daily chores of a crofter's son. But inside, with his grandmother, the world became infinite and strange. Tonight, Maeve intoned, her milky blue eyes fixed on the flames, I will tell you of the Puca. Not the simple bedtime story to make you behave, mind. This is the true telling, passed down from mother to daughter since a time when the world was all forest and mist. It is a story of a creature born from the very soul of the land, a creature of contradiction, a piece of magic that is neither wholly good nor entirely wicked. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. The fire seemed to dim for a heartbeat, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening and stretching. The Puca, she continued, is not born like a lamb or a calf. It does not have a mother or a father. It is a coalescence. It is a gathering of the unspoken fears of the wild places, the unspent laughter of a hidden stream, the loneliness of a standing stone in an empty field, and the raw, untamed joy of a storm. When these things mix in a certain way, under a moon that is neither waxing nor waning, but caught perfectly between, a puca stirs. It pulls itself from the bog, from the dark hollow of an ancient oak, or simply steps out of a patch of deep shadow where the sunlight has not touched the ground for 1,000 years. Finn's breath caught in his throat. He could almost see it, a formless thing of mist and intention pulling itself from the black water of the bog behind their farm, its eyes opening for the first time, reflecting a starless sky. Its first life is a short, frantic thing, Maeve whispered. A flicker of existence in the shape of a moth, drawn to the false moon of our candle flame here. Then a field mouse scurrying through the roots of the heather. Then a crow cawing a challenge to the dawn. It tries on shapes like you or I might try on coats, learning the feel of bone and feather and fur. It is learning what it is to be. And in this learning, it is vulnerable. It can be scattered by a strong wind, or its nascent spirit can be snared by darker things that hunger for such raw young magic. "What darker things, Gran?" Finn asked, his voice a hushed thing. Maeve's gaze shifted from the fire to the dark window, where the night pressed its face against the glass. "The fear Gorta, the hungry man, who walks the roads in times of famine, his touch bringing withering. The sleuch, the host of the unforgiven dead, who fly on the storm winds, seeking to draw more souls into their wretched flock. To them, a young Puca is a tender morsel of power. Its survival depends on its cunning, its speed, and a little bit of the luck of the land itself. It must learn the rules of its own nature before the wilds, or the things within them, consume it." She fell silent then, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hiss of the peat. Finn did not speak. He knew the first chapter of the tale was over. It was not a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Not really. It was a living thing, and tonight Maeve had merely planted its seed in the fertile soil of his imagination. He looked into the fire, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape within the embers. A horse, a goat, a man, all shifting, changing, before dissolving back into the relentless glow. The wind outside moaned, a low, plaintive sound, and for the first time Finn wondered if it was just the wind, or if it was something else, something listening. The naming of the nameless. The young Puca, a being of pure potential without memory or name, knew its existence only as a series of sensations. Its first coherent thought was not a word, but a feeling, the crushing, suffocating pressure of the Sithe mound it had fled. It had been drawn there, a moth to a gilded flame, by the shimmering, alien music that seeped from the fairy fort. The beauty of it had been a physical ache, a melody that promised to unmake and remake it into something beautiful and eternal, but forever bound to the whims of the Sithe court. It had escaped, a frantic, tumbling flight in the form of a terrified hare, its heart a frantic drum against its ribs. Now it huddled in the roots of a great, gnarled whitethorn tree, its branches a protective lattice against the moon. The Puca was a creature of the wild, but the Sithe were a different kind of wild, an ordered, ancient, and possessive wild that sought to own all it touched. The Puca felt a deep, instinctual revulsion. It would not be owned. Its form shifted, unstable. One moment it was the hare, its long ears twitching at every rustle. The next it was a sleek, dark fox, its low belly pressed to the cold earth. Then, for a fleeting second, it was something in between, a thing of nightmare and shadow. It had no core, no true self to anchor it. This was its greatest weakness. Without a purpose, without an identity, it was merely a collection of stolen shapes, a reflection with no original. A change in the air made it still. The scent of rain was coming, but beneath it, something else. Smoke. Not the clean, sharp smoke of a lightning-struck tree, but the dense, earthy smell of a hearth fire. Peat. and with it the faint, tantalizing aroma of something cooking, oat cake. The sensations triggered a memory that was not its own, a genetic imprint from the land itself. Warmth, safety, a respite from the endless, hungry dark. Cautiously, it uncoiled from the roots. It chose the form of a large, black crow. The shape felt comfortable. Wings offered distance, and the crow's cunning mind was a useful tool. It launched itself into the damp air, its flight silent, a stitch of darkness sewing its way across the twilight sky. It followed the scent down into a gentle valley, where a small stone cottage nestled against a hill, a thread of gray smoke rising from its chimney into the vast, indifferent sky. A soft yellow light spilled from its single window, a tiny, defiant sun in the encroaching night. The puca alighted on the stone wall that encircled the cottage's small garden, its head cocked, its obsidian eyes taking in every detail. This was the home of Maeve, the storyteller, and inside, listening with rapt attention, was Finn. The puca felt a pull, a curiosity that was more profound than its hunger. It was not drawn to the people, not exactly. It was drawn to the story. Maeve's words, though it could not hear them clearly through the thick walls, were a vibration in the air, a pattern of power. She was speaking of the old things. She was speaking of it. For the first time, the puca had a concept for itself. It was a puca. The word gave it a boundary, a definition. It was no longer a nameless, shifting terror. It was a specific thing with a history and a nature. This naming, this acknowledgement from the world of men was a kind of anchor. It felt more solid, more real, perched on that cold stone wall than it ever had in the heart of the wild. It watched as the boy, Finn, left the cottage, his face a mask of wonder and thought. The puca felt an echo of that wonder. This boy, whose mind was now filled with its legend, had, in a way, participated in its creation. The puca did not understand this connection, not yet. It only knew that the boy's presence was a focal point, a still center in its chaotic world. Later, when the moon was high and the cottage was dark, the puca shifted again. It became a dark horse, sleek and powerful, with intelligent eyes that held a flicker of something other than equine simplicity. It trotted silently to the edge of the garden, where a few late-blooming flowers nodded in the night air. It lowered its head and lipped at a cluster of heather, not to eat, but to taste the place, to commit the scent of this specific hearth to its memory. It had found a point of interest, a point of reference. It had a name now, and it had a place to watch. For a creature born of chaos, these were the first, fragile steps towards having a life. It turned and melted back into the night, but a part of its essence remained, tied to the boy and the old woman's stories, a thread of magic now woven into the fabric of their lives. The boy and the black horse. The memory of his grandmother's story clung to Finn throughout the following day, a persistent mist that colored all his chores. When he carried water from the well, he peered into its dark, cool depths, half expecting to see a pair of shifting, intelligent eyes looking back. When he drove the 2 dairy cows back to their pasture, the way a lone hawk circled high overhead seemed less like random flight and more like a deliberate searching patrol. The world had become a page from one of Maeve's tales, and he was walking through it, a character in a story he did not fully understand. The following evening, a restlessness took hold of him. The four walls of the cottage felt too close, the peat smoke too thick. With a murmured excuse to his mother, he slipped out into the twilight. The sky was a vast canvas of bruised purple and fiery orange, where the sun had bled away behind the hills. A sharp, clean wind swept in from the Atlantic, carrying the salt tang of the sea and whipping Finn's unruly hair across his face. He pulled his woolen brat, his cloak, tighter around his shoulders, and struck out away from the village, towards the high, lonely moorland that lay behind their farm. This was the domain of gorse and heather, of granite bones pushing through the thin skin of the earth. It was a place of ancient silence, broken only by the mournful cry of the curlew and the constant sigh of the wind. Finn felt a thrill that was part fear, part exhilaration. He was trespassing, not on another man's land, but in a realm where the rules of the everyday world grew thin and fragile. He walked until the lights of the village were mere pinpricks far below, and the only illumination came from the rising moon, a pale, pock-marked coin in the velvety sky. He found a familiar spot, a flat granite slab sheltered by a rocky outcrop where he often came to think. He sat, drawing his knees to his chest, and watched the stars prickle to life one by one. The immensity of it all made his own small life feel insignificant, yet strangely connected to something vast and eternal. It was then that he heard it. A sound that was not the wind, nor any common night creature. It was the soft, deliberate crunch of a hoof on damp earth. His breath hitched. He turned his head slowly, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, at the edge of the circle of moonlight, stood a horse. It was like no horse he had ever seen. It was jet black, a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its coat was sleek, shimmering with a subtle, oily sheen, and its mane and tail were long and wild, like tangled skeins of shadow. It was powerfully built, with a deep chest and strong, clean limbs. Yet it possessed an otherworldly grace, a lightness of being that suggested it was not bound by the same laws of gravity as a common beast. But its eyes, they were what held Finn transfixed. They were a luminous, intelligent amber, and in their depths swirled a knowledge that was ancient and deeply unsettling. This was no animal. This was the Puca. For a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other. The Puca stood perfectly still, its head held high, its ears pricked forward. It assessed him, and Finn felt the weight of that assessment, a sensation of being peeled open, his thoughts and fears laid bare. He felt no malice, not exactly. What he felt was a profound, alien curiosity, laced with a power that could, on a whim, crush him. Trembling, driven by an impulse he did not understand, Finn slowly rose to his feet. He did not run. Running was what a rabbit did, and he knew with a certainty that chilled his blood that this creature could be a fox in an instant. He took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The Puca did not move. It watched him, its amber eyes unblinking. I know you," Finn whispered, his voice a thin, reedy thing in the vastness of the moor. "My grandmother, she told me. You're the Puca." At the sound of the word, a change seemed to come over the creature. It let out a soft, blowing breath, a puff of steam in the cool air, and took a single, fluid step towards him. The distance between them closed. Finn could smell it now, a wild scent like damp earth, crushed bracken, and the cold, clean air of high places. He raised a hand, slow and steady, his fingers shaking. The puka lowered its great head. It nudged his outstretched hand with its velvety muzzle. The touch was electric, a jolt not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated life shot up Finn's arm. It was a cascade of sensations: the taste of wild berries, the sound of a waterfall in a deep glen, the feeling of flying, the terror of being hunted, the joy of a sun-warmed rock. It was 1,000 lives compressed into a single heartbeat. And then a voice. It was not a sound that traveled through the air to his ears, but one that bloomed directly inside his mind, a rustle of leaves and the echo of stone. You see, you listen, you are of the hearth. The words were not English, nor were they Irish. They were pure meaning, unfiltered by language. Before Finn could form a thought, a question, the puka moved again. It turned its body, presenting its flank to him. The invitation was as clear as it was terrifying. It wanted him to mount. A war raged within him. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to turn, to flee back down the hill to the safety of walls and firelight. But the memory of his grandmother's voice, the look in her milky eyes, the sheer, staggering wonder of this moment, it all conspired to silence the fear. This was the story. He was in it now. He reached out, his fingers sinking into the creature's mane. It was not coarse like horsehair, but surprisingly soft, like cool silk. He found a foothold in a tangle of heather root and pulled himself onto the puka's back. There was no saddle, no bridle. He gripped the mane tightly, his legs clamping against the powerful, warm body. The moment he was settled, the puka moved. It did not walk or trot. It exploded into a gallop, a surge of power that stole the breath from Finn's lungs. The world became a blur of streaking shadows and moon-washed rock. The wind tore at his clothes and whipped tears from his eyes. They were not running on the ground. It felt like they were skimming it, the puka's hooves touching the earth only lightly, a percussion beat in a symphony of speed. He clung on, his heart in his throat, his knuckles white. They raced across the moors, leaping over streams and gorse bushes with impossible ease. They descended into a dark wooded glen where the moonlight could not penetrate, and the puka's form seemed to merge with the shadows, its hooves making no sound on the carpet of fallen leaves. They shot out of the woods and up a steep, rocky incline, moving with the sure-footed agility of a goat. This was not a mere ride. It was a baptism. It was the puka showing him its domain, sharing a fraction of its own wild nature. Finn's fear began to melt away, replaced by a wild, soaring joy. He was flying. He was part of the night, part of the wind, part of the ancient, untamed soul of the land. He lost all sense of time. He was a leaf in a hurricane, a note in a wild song. The puka was not trying to throw him. It was carrying him, showing him a world that existed just beyond the sight of ordinary men. Finally, as abruptly as it began, the ride ended. They stood once more on the granite slab where it had started. The puka was not even breathing heavily. Finn slid from its back, his legs wobbling, his entire body thrumming with the residual energy of the journey. He looked at the creature, into those ancient amber eyes, and he saw something new there, not just power or curiosity, but a flicker of recognition. A connection had been forged in that wild gallop, a bond woven from moonlight, speed, and shared silence. The puka tossed its head, a gesture that was almost equine, yet filled with a meaning that was profoundly other. Then it turned and, without a backward glance, trotted into the deep shadows of the rocky outcrop. One moment it was there, a solid, powerful form. The next, it had melted into the darkness, leaving Finn alone under the cold, watchful stars. He stood there for a long time, the wind cooling the sweat on his brow. He could still feel the ghost of the ride in his muscles, the echo of that silent voice in his mind. He looked down at his hand, the one the puka had nudged. It still tingled. He was no longer just Finn, the crofter's son. He was Finn who had ridden the puka. He had stepped into the story, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could never step out again. The path of his life had forked, and he had taken the road that led into the wild, into the myth, and he felt no desire to turn back. The weight of a whispered secret. The walk back down from the high moor was a journey through two worlds. Finn's body moved through the familiar landscape, the scent of damp turf, the rough texture of stone beneath his fingertips, the distant, comforting bleat of a sheep. But his spirit still galloped with the puka under the cold, brilliant stars. His legs felt like water, his muscles trembled with a pleasant exhaustion, but his mind was a raging sea, tossing with the waves of what he had seen, felt, and heard. The silent voice in his head, "You are of the hearth," echoed like a bell struck in a deep cavern, its vibrations touching the very core of him. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cottage, the iron hinges groaning a familiar protest. The warmth inside was a physical wall, thick with the smells of stew and peat smoke. His father, Liam, a man with shoulders broad from a lifetime of labor and a face weathered like old leather, looked up from mending a fishing net by the fire. His mother, Bridget, her hands dusted with flour from the evening's baking, turned from the hearth, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp concern in a heartbeat. "Finn, your face, Yusakradog," she said, using the old term for a sheet of dried seaweed. "Where have you been in the dark? We were starting to worry." The words were a net thrown over him. He stood frozen on the threshold, the night's secret a living, breathing thing trapped in his chest, fighting to get out. To speak of it would be to make it real in their world, to drag the wild, moon-drenched magic of the puka into this room, the black pot over the fire, the rough-hewn table, the crucifix on the wall. He knew, with an instinct as old as storytelling itself, that some mysteries are diminished by the telling. They become flattened, made manageable, stripped of their power. The puka was not manageable. Its power was in its wildness. I was just on the high moor," he managed, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. "Lost track of the time. The stars were very bright." It was a pathetic offering, a handful of dust when he held a diamond. His father grunted, his eyes, the same shade of sea gray as Finn's, narrowing slightly. "The high moor is no place for a boy after sundown. There are badgers there, and foxes, and things a sight less friendly." He didn't say the old names, but they hung in the air between the pops of the peat. The Daine Side, the Fear Gorta. In his father's practical world, these were not stories for telling, but dangers for avoiding. "I was careful," Finn mumbled, slipping past them to the ladder that led to the loft where he slept. He needed to be alone, to feel the rough wool of his blanket, to stare into the darkness and replay every second of the ride. "Wash for supper," his mother called after him, her worry softening into routine. "And mind you don't track mud on the floor." Later, as he lay in his small bed, the sounds of his parents settling for the night rising from below, the weight of the secret felt immense. It was a stone in his gut. He had shared everything with them his entire life: a skinned knee, a lost lamb, a perfect seashell found on the strand. Now, he held the greatest thing that had ever happened to him, and he had to lock it away. He understood, for the first time, the lonely burden of knowledge. To be of the hearth was to be rooted in family and home. But his ride had shown him he was also of the wild, a part of something his family could not or would not see. The next day, the secret began to shape his actions. He volunteered to take the cows to the farthest pasture, a place that bordered the wild moorland. While the animals grazed, their slow, contented chewing a counterpoint to his racing heart, he scanned the tree line, the rocky outcrops, the shifting patterns of light and shadow. He wasn't looking for a horse, not really. He was looking for a shift in the air, a concentration of silence, a feeling. He found nothing but wind and grass. In the afternoon, he was sent to the village to fetch a sack of salt from the merchant. The village was a clutch of whitewashed cottages huddled around a dusty crossroads, with a small stone church standing at one end like a stern schoolmaster. The familiar sights and sounds, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the gossip of women drawing water from the well, the shouts of children playing, felt different now. They seemed smaller, more fragile. These people went about their lives, concerned with the price of salt, the health of a calf, the coming weather, completely unaware that a creature of ancient myth walked the hills above their homes, and that he, Finn, carried its mark. He saw old Seamus, the ferryman, sitting on a bench outside the tavern, whittling a piece of driftwood. Seamus was known to have the sight, and was often consulted about lost items or the meaning of dreams. Their eyes met for a moment, and Seamus paused his whittling. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his watery blue eyes holding Finn's with an unnerving intensity. Did he know? Could he see the shimmer of the Puca's magic clinging to him like pollen? Finn quickly looked away, his cheeks burning, and hurried on. That evening, he found himself alone with his grandmother, Maeve. She was carding wool, her gnarled fingers working with a slow, practiced rhythm. The firelight danced on the deep lines of her face, each one a groove carved by a lifetime of stories. He sat at her feet, the words pressing against his teeth. He wanted to tell her. He needed to.
She was the only one who would understand, the only one whose world was large enough to hold the Puca without breaking. He took a deep breath. "Gran," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I was on the high moor last night." She didn't look up from her work, but her hands stilled. The only sound was the soft pull-scrape of the carding tools ceasing. The air in the room grew thick, waiting. I, Salaliot, he said, the words tumbling out now. The Puca. It was a black horse. It spoke to me, in my head. It let me ride it. We went so fast, faster than anything, through the glen and over the rocks. He told her everything. The luminous amber eyes, the feel of the silken mane, the terrifying, exhilarating speed, the silent voice. When he finished, he was breathless, his heart pounding as if he had just completed the wild ride all over again. Maeve was silent for a long time. She placed the carding tools slowly on her lap and finally turned her milky gaze upon him. There was no surprise in her eyes, no fear, no disbelief. There was only a deep, profound solemnity. "I know, Astorine," she said softly. "I felt the change in you when you came in last night. You had the look of someone who has seen the other side of the hill." She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his head, a gentle, blessing weight. The Puca does not choose lightly. To be seen by it is one thing. To be acknowledged, to be ridden, that is a great thing, and a heavy one. You carry a trust now, Finn. You are a bridge between the hearth and the wild. "What does it want from me?" Finn asked, the question that had haunted him finally voiced. "It may not want anything a person would understand," she replied, her voice low and serious. "Its wants are the wants of the land, to be remembered, to be respected. Perhaps it is lonely. Perhaps it sees in you a keeper of the old ways, a listener. This bond, it is a thread of the old magic. You must guard it. There are those," she glanced towards the window, in the direction of the village and the church, "who would see that thread cut. They fear what they do not understand, and they destroy what they fear." Her words settled over him, not as a comfort, but as a confirmation of the responsibility he now carried. The secret was no longer just his to keep. It was a trust to be protected.
The joy of the ride was still there, a bright, hot ember in his memory, but it was now ringed by the cold, hard stone of caution. He was part of a story, yes, but it was not a simple tale of adventure. It was a story of power, and where there is power, there is always danger. He had stepped into the legend, and the legend had a shadow. The language of earth and sky. The days that followed were a lesson in a new kind of perception. Under his grandmother's subtle guidance, Finn began to learn the language of the Puca, a language not of words, but of signs, sensations, and the subtle textures of the world itself. Maeve, who had spent a lifetime listening to the whispers of the land, became his tutor in this silent curriculum. "It will not come when you call, like a dog," she told him one afternoon while they gathered bog myrtle, its sharp, clean scent filling the air. "You cannot summon it. You can only make yourself available. You must learn to be still in a way that is not passive, but receptive, like the surface of a still lake waiting for the moon's reflection." She taught him to read the weather not as a farmer would for rain or sun, but as a poet of the wild. A sudden spiraling gust of wind was not merely a change in pressure. It could be a signature, a flourish left by a passing spirit. The way the mist clung to a particular hawthorn tree, refusing to burn off with the morning sun, could indicate a place where the veil between worlds was thin. A ring of frosted mushrooms, a fairy fort, was not just to be avoided out of superstition. It was a node of potent alien energy, a place the Puca might frequent to taste its strange power. Finn learned to offer gifts, but not the kind one would leave for a human. He would take a piece of the dark, dense fruit cake his mother baked, rich with dried berries and nuts, and leave it on a particular flat stone near the high moor, a place that felt charged with potential. He did not wait to see if it was taken. The act of giving was the prayer. He would bring a handful of oats, not the common feed for their livestock, but a special handful he had winnowed himself, and scatter it in a small, secret clearing. The offering was not about sustenance. What sustenance could a creature of magic need? It was about acknowledgement, about building a bridge of small, consistent gestures. He began to spend hours in quiet observation.
He would sit with his back against the sun-warmed stone of the granite outcrop, his eyes half closed, and simply feel. He felt the slow, patient life of the lichen beneath his fingers. He felt the frantic, hidden scurrying of beetles in the peat. He felt the immense, soaring loneliness of the hawk circling on a thermal high above. He was learning to listen to the chorus of existence and to pick out the unique, powerful note that was the puca. Days turned into a week, then 2. The offerings disappeared, but he never saw the black horse. Doubt began to creep in, a sly, insidious voice. Had it all been a dream? A fantastical concoction of an overactive imagination fueled by his grandmother's stories? The mundane world of chores and village life pressed in, threatening to flatten the extraordinary experience into a mere memory. Then, one evening, as he was bringing the cows back for milking, he felt it. It was a change in the quality of the silence. The birds did not stop singing, but their songs became more deliberate, a conscious performance. The air grew still and heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. A ripple moved through the herd. The lead cow lifted her head, her ears swiveling, her large brown eyes wide with a primal awareness. She lowed, a deep, uneasy sound, and the others quickened their pace, their hides twitching. Finn's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. He stood still, turning slowly, his senses stretched to their limits. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he felt a presence, a vast, focused attention resting upon him from the deep shadows of the old oak wood that bordered the pasture. He did not call out. He did not move towards it. He simply stood, making himself the still lake his grandmother had described. He let his fear and his excitement wash over him without clinging to either. He was simply present and receptive. From the tree line, a figure emerged, but it was not the black horse. It was a great, shaggy goat, its coat the color of storm clouds and weathered granite. Its horns were immense, spiraling back from its broad head in cruel, beautiful curves. Its eyes were the same luminous amber, holding the same ancient intelligence. It stood regarding him, one cloven hoof pawing lightly at the turf. The creature exuded a smell of hot stone, heather, and wild musk. This was the Puca, the same being, a different skin. The goat lowered its head for a moment, then tossed it back, a challenge and a greeting in one. It took a few steps forward, its movement powerful and deliberate. It stopped a dozen paces away. Finn could see the individual wiry hairs of its coat, the sharp vertical pupils in the golden eyes. Again, the voice bloomed in his mind, not a rustle this time, but the sound of rocks grinding deep within the earth. You learn. You listen. The words were accompanied by a flood of sensation, the feeling of immense age, of standing on a windswept cliff for centuries, of knowing the taste of every storm that had ever blown in from the sea. Finn felt a profound respect for this form. The horse was speed and freedom. The goat was endurance, stubbornness, and a deep-rooted connection to the high, lonely places. He remembered his offering. Slowly, so as not to startle the creature, he reached into the leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a small, hard apple from their tree, one he had been saving. He held it out on his flat palm. The puca, in its goat form, ambled closer. It sniffed the air, its warm breath pluming in the cool evening. It lipped the apple from his hand, its touch surprisingly gentle. The connection was made again, the electric jolt of shared existence. This time, it was the taste of high-altitude herbs, the feeling of balancing on a precarious ledge, the satisfaction of a hard-won territory. It crunched the apple, the sound loud in the stillness. Then it turned and, with agility that defied its bulky form, bounded up a near vertical rock face that Finn would have thought impossible to climb. It stood on the summit for a moment, a silhouette of primal power against the fading sky, and then it was gone. The spell was broken.
The birds resumed their casual songs. The air moved again. The cows, relieved, continued their plodding journey home. Finn stood, his palms still tingling, the taste of wild thyme and granite dust lingering in his mind. He had not been dreaming. The bond was real, and he had just learned his first true lesson. The Puca was not a horse. It was everything. It was the land itself, wearing a mask of flesh and bone, and it was slowly, carefully teaching him how to see its true face. The story was not over. It was only just beginning. The echoes in the stone. The encounter with the goat Puca solidified a new reality for Finn. The creature was no longer a singular, terrifying event, but a persistent, shifting presence in his life, a secret companion to his mundane existence. He found himself seeing its influence everywhere, not as a haunting, but as a layer of meaning superimposed upon the world. A strangely twisted branch became a sign it had passed. A patch of trampled ferns spoke of its resting place. The world was a text, and the Puca was its most compelling author. He began to seek out places heavy with time, places his grandmother called thin, where the past felt less like a memory and more like a scent still lingering in the air. One such place was the Ring of Brawn, a circle of moss-clad standing stones on a desolate hilltop a half-day's walk from the farm. Local lore held it was a place of kings and druids, a site of power where the sun was worshipped long before the first Christian bell tolled in the valley. Most villagers avoided it, crossing themselves when they had to speak of it. For Finn, it became a destination. The day he decided to go was a day of high, scudding clouds and fitful sunlight. He told his parents he was exploring the high pastures for missing sheep, a plausible excuse. The journey was a pilgrimage. He felt a pull, a magnetic attraction drawing him toward the ancient circle. As he climbed the final rise, the wind whipped at his clothes with renewed force, a guardian challenging his approach. The Ring of Brawn stood stark against the tumultuous sky. 12 stones, some taller than 2 men, leaned inward like grieving giants. The grass within the circle was a different, lusher green, and the silence was profound, a dense blanket that smothered even the sound of the wind, which seemed to part and flow around the sacred space. Finn stepped across the invisible threshold between one world and another. The air within was still, cool, and carried the taste of age, of cold stone and forgotten ceremonies. He moved to the center of the circle and placed his hand flat against the largest stone, its surface rough and cold, pitted by millennia of rain. He closed his eyes, trying to feel its history, to hear the echoes of the past. At first, there was only the solid, unyielding silence of granite. Then a warmth began to bloom beneath his palm. A vibration, low and deep, thrummed up his arm. A vision, sharp and sudden, exploded behind his eyes. He was no longer Finn. He was taller, older, his shoulders draped in the hide of a wolf. His hands were stained with woad, tracing intricate spirals on a drumhead. A fire roared in the center of the circle where he now stood, its flames leaping toward a sky ablaze with stars unknown to him.
Figures danced in the firelight, their shadows grotesque and magnificent against the stones. The air thrummed with chanting, a low, guttural song that was a plea to the earth and a challenge to the heavens. He felt a power flowing through him, a connection to the turning seasons, the growth of the crops, the fate of his people. He was a conduit for forces that made him feel both immense and insignificant. The vision shifted. The same circle, but the fire was gone. Men in rough-spun robes, their heads shaved in the tonsure of early monks, were using heavy sledges and levers to topple one of the great stones. It fell with a ground-shaking crash, a sound of profound wrongness. He felt a sharp, spiritual pain, a severing. The monks prayed, their Latin words a foreign, sharp-edged sound against the soft, ancient music of the place. They were exorcising the old gods, building their new faith upon the broken bones of the old. The vision shifted again, faster now, a blur of images. A young woman with hair like flame, her hands bound, weeping at the base of the central stone. A desperate plea whispered to the unheeding granite. A flash of dark fur, a rabbit, disappearing into the gorse. The woman was gone by morning, her bonds chewed through. Two clans meeting at the circle for a truce, their tension a palpable fog. A sleek black crow landing on the central stone, cawing 3 times, causing both chieftains to startle and, miraculously, laugh, the tension broken. A lone warrior, wounded and lost in a blizzard, stumbling into the circle and collapsing. A great, shaggy goat appearing, nudging him awake, leading him through the whiteout to a shepherd's hut, saving his life. The visions were not just images, they were emotions, sensations, a cascade of lives and moments, all tied to this place and to the shifting, watchful presence of the Puca. It had been here, through all of it, a witness, a trickster, a savior. It was the guardian of the old ways, the spirit of the land reacting to the comings and goings of the temporary creatures who walked upon it. The final vision was the most powerful. He saw the Puca itself, not in any animal form, but as a thing of swirling mist and concentrated shadow, standing in the very spot where he now stood. It was reaching out, its formless appendage touching the stone, and the stone was listening. The Puca was not just witnessing history, it was imparting it. It was storing the memories of the land in the granite, using the stones like a library, a chronicle of all it had seen. The connection broke. Finn staggered back, his hand tearing away from the stone as if burned. He was gasping, back in his own body, his own time. The wind howled outside the circle, but inside, the silence had returned, now heavy with new meaning. He looked at the stones with awe. They were not mere rocks, they were pages, and the Puca was both the author and the librarian. He understood now why the creature had drawn him here. It was showing him its purpose, its long, long life. It was giving him context. Their bond was not a random fancy. He was being invited not just to witness the Puca, but to understand its role in the great, slow story of Ireland itself. He was being taught that the magic was not gone. It was sleeping in the stones, in the hills, in the very air, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. He left the Ring of Brone a different boy than the one who had entered. He carried the weight of centuries in his heart. The Puca was not just a playful spirit, it was a historian, a keeper of lost truths. And Finn, the crofter's son, had just been granted access to its archive. The secret he carried was no longer just a personal wonder, it was a sacred trust. He walked home slowly, the echoes of druidic chants and the feel of cold, living stone haunting his every step. The priest and the parchment.
The world of the farm and the village, which had once felt like the entirety of existence, now seemed to Finn a small, brightly lit stage upon a vast, dark, and ancient continent. He moved through his chores with a part of his mind always elsewhere, listening for the subtle shift in the wind that spoke of the Puca's nearness, feeling for the tremor in the earth that might be the echo of a forgotten ceremony. The visions at the Ring of Brawn had opened a door in his soul, and he could not close it. It was in this state of heightened awareness that he first truly noticed the change in the village. A new presence had arrived, one whose energy was diametrically opposed to the soft, wild magic of the moorlands. Father Brennan, a young priest newly assigned to the parish, was a man carved from zealous certainty. Where old Father O'Halloran had been gentle, his faith like a worn, comfortable blanket, Father Brennan's was a sharp, newly forged sword. He saw the world in absolutes, light and dark, salvation and sin, the Holy Church and the pagan darkness. Finn was in the village with his father, delivering a cartload of peat, when he first felt the chill of the priest's gaze. Father Brennan was standing on the steps of the small stone church, his black robes a stark slash against the whitewashed wall. He was a lean man with a face that was all sharp angles and a jaw perpetually clenched as if in opposition to the world's imperfections. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, scanned the villagers with an unsettling intensity, missing nothing. As Liam and Finn unloaded the peat, the priest descended the steps and approached. "A fine load of turf, Liam," he said, his voice carrying a nasal, educated cadence that set it apart from the soft, lilting brogue of the locals. "It reminds us that even the earth, in its lowly state, can be put to good use to warm the faithful." "It does indeed, Father," Liam replied, nodding respectfully, but keeping his eyes on his work. There was a wariness in his father's posture that Finn had never seen before. Father Brennan's gaze then fell upon Finn. It was not a look of pastoral kindness. It was an assessment, a probing scrutiny. "And this is your boy, Finn, is it?" "Yes, Father," Finn mumbled, his throat suddenly dry. "He has the look of one who spends much time in the hills," the priest observed, his tone neutral, yet layered with meaning. "A solitary pursuit for a boy so young. One must be cautious."
An idle mind, left to wander in lonely places, can sometimes fill with fancies, illusions whispered by the lonely wind. A cold knot tightened in Finn's stomach. He felt seen, but not in the way the Puca saw him. This was not a seeing of recognition, but of suspicion. It was as if the priest could smell the wild magic on him, could sense the peat smoke and heather of the high moors clinging to his soul, and found it unclean. "He's a good lad, Father," Liam said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "He does his chores. He helps his mother." "I do not doubt it," Father Brennan said, a thin, humorless smile touching his lips. "But the devil finds work for idle hands and idle minds. It is good for the youth to be engaged in prayer, in useful study, not in wandering." He let the word hang in the air, a condemnation of Finn's most cherished freedom. The priest then turned his attention to a group of older women gossiping by the well. Their conversation died instantly. "Good morning, mothers," he said, his voice taking on a louder, more public tone. "I trust your prayers are fervent. We must all be vigilant. The old ways, the superstitious beliefs that once held these lands in thrall, are not merely harmless stories. They are a poison, a lingering darkness that keeps souls from the pure light of Christ. We must root them out. We must cleanse this parish, not just of sin, but of the memory of sin. One of the women, a widow named Nuala, who was known to leave offerings for the good people at a certain hawthorn bush, flushed a deep red and looked at her feet. The priest's message was clear. The old comforts, the small private pacts with the land, were now a mark of shame. That Sunday, the church was packed. Father Brennan's sermon was not about love or forgiveness. It was a declaration of war. The Apostle Peter tells us, his voice rang out, sharp and clear from the pulpit, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." He paused, his pale eyes sweeping over the congregation, pinning each person in their pew. "But I say to you, here in this place, the devil does not always come as a roaring lion. He is cunning. He is a deceiver. He comes in forms that are familiar, that are of this very land, to lull you into a false sense of security." Finn sat between his parents, his skin crawling. He could feel the fear radiating from the people around him. This was a different kind of story than the ones his grandmother told. This story demanded fear, not wonder. "He comes us a will-o'-the-wisp to lead the traveler astray into the treacherous bog," the priest thundered. "He comes us a phantom hound to herald death. And there are those who speak in whispers of a creature, a shapeshifter, a demon that wears the skin of a beast to work its mischief." He slammed his fist on the pulpit, the crack echoing in the stone chapel. "They call it the Puca." A collective sharp intake of breath filled the church. Finn felt his blood run cold. He stared straight ahead at the crucifix behind the altar, but all he could see were the luminous amber eyes of the goat on the hillside. "Do not be fooled by its tricks," Father Brennan cried. "It may seem to help you one day, only to lead you to your ruin the next. This is the nature of the fiend. It offers you a ride on its back, promising speed and thrill, but its true destination is the mouth of hell itself. It is a predator of souls. And I tell you now, this parish will not tolerate such a blight. We will not share our land with a demon. We will drive it out. We will sanctify these hills with prayer and with purity, and we will send this creature back to the darkness from whence it came." The sermon ended in a tense, fearful silence. As the congregation filed out, people avoided each other's eyes. The easy, familiar world of the village had been fractured. Father Brennan had not just condemned a mythical creature. He had condemned a part of their heritage, a fragment of the world that Finn now knew to be real and beautiful and sacred. Walking home, the silence between Finn and his parents was heavy. His father finally spoke, his voice low. "The new priest, he speaks with great fire. He speaks of things he does not understand," Finn said, the words bursting from him with more force than he intended. His mother looked at him, her face etched with worry. "Finn, you must be careful. Do not speak of your grandmother's stories. Not to anyone, not anymore." The message was clear. The bridge the Puca had built between the hearth and the wild was now under siege. The secret he carried was no longer just a personal trust. It had become a dangerous liability. The Puca's world of ancient stone and whispering wind had just collided with a world of parchment, prayer, and purifying fire, and Finn was trapped. The Hare at the Hearth.
The atmosphere in the cottage that night was thick with unspoken thoughts. The fire, usually a source of comfort, seemed to cast anxious, leaping shadows that mirrored the disquiet in their hearts. Liam sat sharpening a scythe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal a grim counterpoint to the priest's fiery words still echoing in their minds. Bridget's knitting needles clicked together with a frantic, nervous energy. Finn stared into the flames, seeing not the glowing peat, but the stern, unforgiving face of Father Brennan. He felt the Puca's presence now, not as a thrill, but as a weight. It was a secret that could burn, a truth that could brand his family as heretics or devil worshippers in the eyes of their community. The priest had drawn a line in the dust of the village square, and Finn knew on which side he stood. He was of the wild, whether he wished it or not. A soft tapping sound came at the door, so faint it was almost lost in the wind's moan. They all looked up. It was late for visitors. Liam stood, his face guarded, and went to the door. He opened it a crack, the wind snatching at the wood and whipping a gust of cold air into the room. There was no one there, just the impenetrable blackness of the moonless night. "It was nothing," he grumbled, starting to push the heavy door shut. "Just the wind." But then a small, dark shape darted between his legs, a blur of speed that shot across the packed earth floor and came to a trembling halt in the very center of the cottage, directly before the hearth. It was a hare. Its fur was the color of damp earth and shadow, and its sides heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. Its long ears were laid flat against its back, and its large, dark eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on Finn. One of its hind legs was held at an awkward angle, a dark, wet stain matting the fur around it. A deep gash, likely from a fox's teeth or a snare, wept blood onto the clean floor. Bridget let out a small, startled cry. Liam stared, his hand still on the door, his face a mask of confusion and superstitious dread. But Finn understood. He looked from the hare's terrified eyes to the dark, silent night beyond the open door. This was no ordinary animal. No hare, no matter how desperate, would flee into the domain of humans, into the light and the fire. It would have chosen to die in the sheltering darkness. This was a deliberate act, a plea. "It's hurt," Finn said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's a wild thing," Liam said, his voice tight. "It should not be in here. It brings the outside in." He took a step forward, his intention to shoo it back into the night clear. "No!" Finn's voice was sharper than he intended. He moved quickly, placing himself between his father and the trembling animal. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, his heart hammering. He was looking into the eyes of the Puca. He was sure of it. This was another test, another layer of the bond. It had come to the hearth, not us, a conqueror, but us, a supplicant. It was trusting him with its vulnerability. "Finn, be careful," his mother whispered, her hands clenched in her woolen skirt. "It's frightened. It will scratch you." But the hare did not move. It continued to watch Finn, its entire being focused on him. The intelligence in its gaze was unmistakable, a stark, ancient awareness that no simple animal possessed. "It needs help," Finn said, not taking his eyes off the creature. "It came to us for help." He reached out, not to touch it,
but to show his empty hands. The hare flinched, but held its ground. Finn then looked at his grandmother, Maeve, who had been observing the entire scene from her chair in the corner, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met his, and she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Bridget," Maeve said, her rustling voice cutting through the tension. "The yarrow and the cobwebs, the comfrey paste I made, fetch them." Bridget hesitated for a moment, caught between her fear of the wild creature and her ingrained respect for her mother-in-law's wisdom. Then, with a resolute breath, she went to the small cupboard where they kept their simple medicines. Finn remained kneeling, a silent guardian. He began to speak to the hare in a low, soothing murmur, the same tone he used with a skittish calf. "It's all right. You're safe here. We'll fix your leg. It's all right." Liam stood by the door, which he had finally closed, his arms crossed. He watched the scene with a deep frown, a battle playing out on his features. He was a practical man. A wild animal in the house was a risk, a bearer of fleas and ill luck. But he was also a man of the land, and he recognized a profound strangeness in this event. He saw the way the hare looked at his son, not with the blind panic of a cornered beast, but with a desperate, knowing plea. He said nothing.
Bridget returned with a bowl of clean water, strips of linen, a jar of sticky cobwebs to staunch bleeding, and a small pot of Maeve's green, pungent comfrey paste. Finn, under his grandmother's quiet direction, began to clean the wound. The hare trembled violently, but did not struggle, did not bite. It allowed Finn to gently wash the gash, pack it with cobwebs, and smear the thick comfrey paste over it before Bridget, her hands now steady, expertly bound the leg with linen. Throughout the entire process, the cottage was silent save for the crackle of the fire and Finn's soft, reassuring whispers. It was a sacred, surreal moment. The wildness of the moor had entered their home and was being tended to with the skills of the hearth. The line Father Brennan had drawn seemed to blur and then vanish entirely within the glow of this single fire. When the bandaging was done, the hare relaxed visibly. The terror in its eyes receded, replaced by a profound exhaustion. It lowered its head, its nose twitching, and simply sat there, accepting the shelter. It was then that Liam, his voice gruff but no longer hostile, spoke. "It can stay by the fire tonight, but it goes at first light." No one argued. Finn moved a small, rough-woven blanket near the warmth of the hearth, and the hare, with a painful, hobbling hop, settled onto it, curling into a tight, furry ball. The family prepared for bed in a state of subdued shock. As Finn climbed the ladder to the loft, he looked back. The hare was asleep, its breathing even, its bandaged leg tucked close. In the dim light, it looked like any other wild creature. But Finn knew. The Puca had crossed the ultimate threshold. It had trusted them with its pain, its body, its very life. It had shown them that even a creature of immense power could be wounded, could be afraid, could need kindness. The hearth had sheltered the wild, and in doing so, had been forever changed. Finn lay in his bed, listening to the wind, but he no longer felt the cold fear Father Brennan had instilled. He felt a warm, fierce protectiveness. The priest Salah had demon, but Finn had held a trembling, wounded hare in his hands, and he had seen a soul. The war for the soul of the parish had begun, and the first battle had been fought not with prayers or proclamations, but with cobwebs, comfrey, and an act of mercy offered in the quiet heart of a storm-tossed night. The Covenant of Cobwebs. The first, pale light of dawn was a hesitant visitor to the cottage, creeping through the single small window and painting the room in shades of gray and silver. Finn had slept only in fitful snatches, his ears straining for any sound from below. He descended the ladder into the main room with a heart full of a strange, protective anxiety. The peat fire was a bed of deep red embers, and the air still held the faint, medicinal scent of comfrey and the wild, musky odor of the hair. The rough-woven blanket by the hearth was empty. A lance of panic shot through him. Had it fled in the night, re-injured and terrified? Had it all been for nothing? But then a subtle movement near the door caught his eye. The hare was there, sitting upright, its long ears swiveling like delicate satellite dishes sampling the morning. It was grooming its face with its front paws, a gesture of returning normalcy that sent a wave of relief washing over Finn. Its dark, intelligent eyes met his, and in them he saw not the terror of the previous night, but a calm, appraising stillness. The bandage on its leg was clean. It had not tried to tear it off. The rest of the family stirred. His mother, Bridget, emerged from her curtained bed, her eyes immediately going to the hare. She let out a soft sigh, a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Liam, pragmatic as ever, began to stoke the fire back to life, his gaze lingering on the wild creature in his home, with a look Finn could not decipher. Not acceptance, perhaps, but a grudging truce. It was Maeve who acted with a quiet, unshakable purpose. She moved to the small pantry and took out a single, perfect leaf of dark green cabbage and a sprig of fragrant parsley. She placed them on a small wooden platter and set it on the floor a respectful distance from the hare. "A guest in the home is entitled to hospitality," she stated, her voice brooking no argument. "Even a guest who arrives unannounced in the dead of night." The hare watched her, its nose twitching. After a long moment, it hobbled forward, favoring its injured leg, and began to nibble delicately at the parsley. The simple, domestic act of an animal eating breakfast in their home was one of the most profoundly strange things Finn had ever witnessed. The Puca was not just visiting, it was dining. The day unfolded within this new, fragile reality. Finn was tasked with mending a section of the dry stone wall that bordered the high pasture. It was hard, physical work, the kind that usually absorbed all his focus. But today, his attention was divided. He worked with one eye on the shifting clouds, the other on the tree line. He was a sentry, standing guard over a secret that was now living, breathing, and eating cabbage in his home. When he returned at midday, the hare was gone. His heart plummeted, but his grandmother, reading his face, shook her head. "Do not fret, Styrin. It left of its own will. It did not flee. It departed. There is a difference." She pointed to the empty platter. "It ate its fill. It accepted our help. The covenant is made." "The covenant?" Finn asked, the word feeling heavy and significant. "An understanding," Maeve explained, her fingers carding a tuft of raw wool. "Older than any priest's blessing. The covenant between the hearth and the wild. We offered shelter and healing without demanding anything in return. It accepted that gift without offering a trick in exchange. A simple act of kindness. But in the world of the old things, there is no such thing. It creates a bond, a debt of honor. You have proven the hearth can be a place of sanctuary, not just for men, but for the spirits of the land itself. That is a powerful thing." The truth of her words settled over Finn. The Puca's arrival had not been a random act of desperation. It had been a test of their character, a probe to see if the bridge it had built with Finn could bear the weight of true trust. By helping it, they had strengthened that bridge immeasurably. That evening, as Finn carried a bucket of water from the well, he felt a familiar shift in the atmosphere. The world grew still. The hair on his arms prickled. He set the bucket down and turned slowly. At the edge of the gorse, where the cultivated land met the wild moor, stood the Puca. But it was in a new form. It was a magnificent, shaggy-coated dog, its fur a mix of storm gray and heather brown, its eyes the same luminous amber. It was larger than any wolfhound, powerfully built, and it stood with a quiet dignity that was neither threatening nor friendly. It was simply present. It did not approach. It simply looked at him, and then it lowered its great head in a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of thanks. Then it turned and trotted up the path into the gathering dusk, its form merging with the shadows until it was gone. Finn stood for a long time, the empty bucket forgotten at his feet. The covenant was not just words. It was a nod in the twilight. It was a shared secret that now included his entire family, binding them to the fate of this magical creature. The Puca had shown them its vulnerability, and in return, it had shown them its gratitude. The war of words from the pulpit seemed a distant, hollow noise, compared to the profound, silent understanding that had passed between them in the quiet of the evening. The hearth had given shelter, and the wild had given its respect. It was a truce written not on parchment, but in cobwebs and comfrey, and sealed with a nod. The shadow in the confessional. The newfound sense of covenant, the profound and silent understanding with the Puca, made the return to the village feel like stepping into a foreign and hostile country. The following Sunday, the air within the stone church was frigid, thick with a fear that had been meticulously cultivated. Father Brennan stood at the pulpit, a stark, black-clad figure against the whitewashed wall. His presence, a cold stone, dropped into the pond of the community, its ripples distorting every familiar face. His sermon was a masterpiece of insinuation, a weapon honed from scripture and suspicion. He did not shout today. His voice was a low, penetrating drone, a poison seeping into the cracks of their faith. "Vigilance, my children," he began, his pale eyes scanning the pews, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on old Nuala, on Seamus the ferryman, and finally, with a chilling weight, on Finn. "Vigilance is the price of purity, for the forces of darkness are not always so obliging us to announce themselves with thunder and brimstone. No, they are subtle. They work through sympathies, through the tolerance of old, wicked ways." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the sides of the pulpit. "They work through the stories we tell our children, stories of creatures that are not of God's creation. Stories that glorify the wild, the untamed, the things that refuse to bow to order and sanctity. When we give these tales a home in our hearts, we open a door, and we may not even notice the chill that enters." Finn sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He could feel the weight of the priest's gaze like a physical pressure. He thought of the hair trembling by their hearth. He thought of the dog's respectful nod in the twilight. This was not a demon. This was a soul, ancient and complex, a part of the land itself. To hear it spoken of as a pestilence felt like a violation. "There are those among you," Father Brennan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that forced the congregation to lean in to hear, "who may believe they are engaging in harmless tradition, leaving a bowl of milk out, muttering an old rhyme for luck, turning a blind eye to the signs of the old world. But I tell you, there is no neutrality in this spiritual war. He who is not with me is against me. To tolerate the darkness is to embrace it." A nervous cough echoed in the silence. Finn saw his mother's knuckles were white where she gripped her prayer book. His father's jaw was set, a muscle twitching in his cheek. After the service, the congregation, filed out into the weak sunlight. The usual chatter was absent. People moved quickly, avoiding conversation, their eyes downcast. The sense of community, once as tangible as the stone of the church itself, had been fractured into a collection of isolated, fearful individuals. Father Brennan stood at the church door, shaking hands, his grip firm and brief. When Finn's family approached, the priest's gaze fixed on Finn. "Liam, Bridget," he nodded. Then his eyes, cold and assessing, turned to Finn. "And young Finn, I trust you are reflecting on the Word of God. A boy your age needs strong guidance. The world offers many distractions." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "My confessional is always open for those who feel the burden of unconventional thoughts." It was not an invitation. It was a summons, a threat. The walk home was silent, the unspoken words screaming in the space between them. The priest's message had been clear. Finn's wandering had been noted. His connection to the old ways fostered by his grandmother was now a mark of suspicion. The following day, the pressure began to tighten its grip. Two of the village boys, sons of men who were particularly fervent in their support of the new priest, cornered Finn as he was checking the fishing nets his father had set in the river. "Heard you've been spending a lot of time up on the moors, Finn," said the larger one, a boy named Donald with a thick neck and a mean smile. "Looking for something or someone?" "Just checking the sheep," Finn said, his voice even, though his heart began to beat a little faster. "My da says only thieves and pagans have business up there now," the other boy, Padrig, chimed in. "Says the good land is down here with the rest of us. Says the high places are cursed." "My da says a lot of things too," Finn replied, turning back to the nets. "Doesn't make them true." Donald stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Father Brennan says the Puca is a liar. Says it can make you see things that aren't there, make you think you're friends with it before it leads you off a cliff." He peered at Finn's face. "You look like you haven't been sleeping. Seeing things, Finn?" The accuracy of the jab was startling. He hadn't been sleeping well, his mind alive with the visions from the standing stones and the memory of the wounded hare. He had been seeing things, true, beautiful, terrifying things. "I'm fine," Finn said tightly, gathering the nets and turning to leave. "We're all watching, Finn," Donald called after him, his voice laced with mock concern. "We're all praying for you." The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. The priest's poison was spreading, turning his own peers into spies and accusers. The shadow had fallen not just over the church, but over the entire village, twisting familiar faces into masks of suspicion.
That night, as he lay in bed, the priest's words echoed in his mind. "My confessional is always open." He imagined the dark, enclosed space, the grilled window, the pressure to give voice to his secret, to name the Puca as a sin and be absolved, to betray the covenant. But to refuse was to mark himself. To remain silent was to confirm his guilt in the eyes of the new order. He was trapped between the truth he knew in his heart and the truth being imposed upon his world. The Puca had given him a glimpse of a vast, ancient, and beautiful mystery. Father Brennan was offering him a small, safe, and sterile box to live in. And he was demanding that Finn betray the mystery to secure his place inside it. The war for the parish was no longer a war of sermons. It had become a war for Finn's very soul, and the battlefield was the silence of his own heart. The gifts of the unseen. The village, once a tapestry of shared lives and unspoken understandings, had become a minefield of sidelong glances and carefully chosen words. Finn felt the change like a constant, low atmospheric pressure, a storm waiting to break. He kept to the farm, his world shrinking to the rhythm of chores and the silent, watchful presence of the hills. The covenant with the Puca was a warm ember in his heart, but the cold wind of Father Brennan's influence threatened to snuff it out. It was in this climate of fear that the first gift appeared. Finn was mucking out the cow byre, the warm, pungent smell of straw and manure a familiar comfort. He thrust his pitchfork into a dense pile of soiled bedding and felt it clink against something hard. Puzzled, he pushed the straw aside. There, nestled in the filth, was a smooth, dark river stone, unusually round and heavy for its size. But it was not the stone itself that caught his breath, it was the carving. Etched into its surface was a perfect, spiraling triskelion, its 3 arms flowing into one another with an ancient, impossible grace. It was a symbol he had seen in his vision at the Ring of Brawn, a mark of the Druids. He wiped the stone clean on his trousers, his heart thumping. It was a message, a reminder. He showed it to his grandmother that evening. Maeve took the stone, her gnarled fingers tracing the grooves with a reverent familiarity. "A seeing stone," she murmured. "The old ones used them to focus their sight, to see beyond the veil. It is a gift of remembrance, a reminder that the old ways are not gone, only sleeping." She handed it back to him, her milky eyes serious. "Keep it hidden. Such things are not looked upon kindly anymore." The second gift came a few days later. He was sent to check the ewe who was due to lamb any day, isolated in a small, stone-walled pen near the edge of the moor. The animal was restless, pacing and bleating in distress. As Finn approached, he saw the problem. The lamb was coming breech, its back legs first, a dangerous presentation that often meant death for both mother and offspring. His father was in the far pasture. There was no time to fetch him. A cold dread washed over Finn. He had assisted with births before, but never something this difficult. He was about to turn and run for help when a movement in the shadows of the pen caught his eye. A large, sleek otter slipped out from behind a water trough. It was wet, its fur dark and gleaming, and it carried a mouthful of dark, waxy leaves. It dropped them at Finn's feet, gave him a look from its sharp, intelligent eyes, and then slid silently through a gap in the stone wall and was gone. Finn picked up the leaves. They were comfrey, but a variety he didn't recognize, growing only in the deepest, wettest parts of the bog. His grandmother had spoken of its potent properties for soothing tissue and easing pain. Without questioning, he crushed the leaves between his palms, releasing their sticky, pungent juice, and gently smeared it over the ew's straining back and the emerging legs of the lamb. He then began the delicate, terrifying work of trying to turn the lamb, his hands slick with the comfrey gel. To his astonishment, the ewe, which had been thrashing in panic, stilled. Her bleats softened to low, grunting moans. The muscles in her birth canal seemed to relax, to become more pliable. With a surge of hope and strength, Finn managed to gently guide the lamb, coaxing it into the correct position. Minutes later, with a final great push from the ewe, a healthy, if somewhat stunned, lamb slid onto the straw. He stood back, his arms trembling, his heart soaring with relief and wonder. The otter, the Puca, it had not just given him a gift, it had given him the precise tool he needed at the exact moment he needed it. It was not a mischievous trick, but an act of profound, life-saving help. The third gift was the most personal. The harassment from Donald and his friends had intensified. They had taken to following him at a distance, their taunts just loud enough to carry. Puca lover, pagan, devil's child. The words were like stones, bruising his spirit. He felt isolated, the weight of his secret becoming a crushing loneliness. One afternoon, seeking solace, he went to his secret clearing, the place where he often left his offerings. The taunts of the day echoed in his mind, and for the first time, a bitter doubt crept in. Was he a fool? Was he risking his family's standing, his own future, for a creature that might, as the priest said, ultimately betray him? He sat with his back against a birch tree, the carved stone heavy in his pocket. A deep sadness settled over him. Then a soft rustling came from the bushes. A small, red fox kit emerged, its eyes bright, its movements playful. It was too young to be afraid. It trotted right up to him, sniffed his boots, and then dropped something from its mouth onto his lap. It was a single, perfect feather from a jay. It was a shock of vibrant blue, a color so bright and unexpected it seemed to have been stolen from the sky itself. The fox kit looked up at him, yipped once, and then scampered back into the undergrowth. Finn picked up the feather. In a world that was growing increasingly gray with fear and condemnation, this feather was a defiant splash of color. It was a gift of beauty for no other reason than to be beautiful. It was a reminder that wonder still existed, that joy was still possible. It was the Puca's answer to his loneliness, a message that resonated deeper than any words. I see your sorrow. Here is a piece of the sky to remind you that it is still there. He held the feather, his eyes stinging with tears that were both sorrow and gratitude. The Puca was not a single thing. It was a teacher, a healer, a friend. It was the spirit of the land itself, responding to the needs of one who listened. The gifts were not random, they were a conversation. The stone for remembrance, the comfrey for healing, the feather for joy. He returned home, the feather tucked safely inside his kinnick. The village and its fears seemed smaller, less significant. He carried proof of a different world, a world that was not cruel or demonic, but responsive, intelligent, and kind. Father Brennan spoke of a God of wrath and rules. The Puca showed him a universe of gifts and grace. The war was not over, but Finn now had his own arsenal. A stone, a memory of a saved life, and a feather blue like a defiant piece of heaven. He was not just a boy with a secret, he was a keeper of wonders. The heart reader's gaze. The gifts had fortified Finn's spirit, but they had also deepened the chasm between his inner world and the one he was forced to inhabit. The carved stone, the memory of the otter's timely aid, the vibrant blue feather, these were treasures he could share with no one, lest they be twisted into evidence of witchcraft or demonic pact. The Puca's lessons were becoming more profound, moving from physical aid to a far more intimate and dangerous form of knowledge. It began on a day of soft, persistent rain. A fine mist hung over the land, muting colors and sounds, turning the world into a watercolor painting. Finn was in the barn, sorting through last year's harvested oats, separating the good grain from the chaff. The rhythmic, monotonous work was a kind of meditation, the rustle of the oats a soothing whisper. He was thinking of nothing in particular, his mind adrift on the gray weather, when a sharp, discordant image shattered his peace. It was a vision, but not his own. He saw a hand, his father's hand, clenched white-knuckled around the handle of his fishing rod. But the feeling attached was not the patient focus of a fisherman. It was a roiling storm of frustration and a deep, gnawing worry. The image was accompanied by the scent of cold river water and the sound of a frustrated sigh. It was so vivid, so sudden, that Finn dropped the basket of oats, the grain scattering across the stone floor. He stood there, his heart pounding, trying to understand. He had not been daydreaming. This was an intrusion, a sensory package delivered directly into his mind. Shaken, he finished his work and went inside for the midday meal. His father, Liam, came in from the rain, his brat soaked dark, water dripping from his brow. He hung his fishing gear by the door with a little more force than was necessary. "No luck?" Bridget asked, stirring the pot over the fire. "The fish aren't biting," Liam grumbled, sitting heavily at the table. "Nothing is. The price of wool is down, the roof on the byre needs mending before winter. Father Brennan's tithe is more than old O'Halloran ever asked for." He ran a hand through his damp hair, and in that gesture, Finn saw the clenched hand from his vision, felt the echo of that same frustrated worry. The connection was made. The vision had been his father's feeling. He had not just imagined it, he had felt it. Later that week, it happened again. He was walking past the cottage of old Nuala, the widow who left offerings for the good people. He saw her in her garden, bent over her herbs, and as he passed, a wave of profound loneliness washed over him, so sharp it made his eyes water. It was a loneliness specific and deep, the empty space in a bed, the silence where a familiar voice used to be. It was accompanied by the faint, ghostly scent of pipe smoke, a scent that had not lingered in her cottage for years. He hurried away, his own heart aching with her sorrow. He was not reading minds, he was reading hearts. He was sensing the unvoiced emotions that people carried, the hidden weights and secret joys, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was another gift, or perhaps a curse, from the Puca. The creature, a master of shifting forms, was teaching him to see beneath the surface of men. The opportunity, and the danger, of this new ability presented itself with the arrival of the merchant from Tralee. A stout, loud man named Mr. O'Rourke, he came every season to buy wool and sell goods from the town. He was a fixture, his arrival a minor holiday. But this time, as O'Rourke stood haggling with Liam over the price of a new scythe blade, Finn felt it. A slick, oily sensation of deceit. It slithered into Finn's perception, accompanied by the metallic taste of a counterfeit coin. He saw in a flash the merchant's secret knowledge. The scythe blade was of inferior steel, poorly tempered, and would break within a month. O'Rourke's jovial smile and booming laugh were a mask, and Finn could see right through it. His father, an honest man who assumed honesty in others, was on the verge of agreeing to the price. "Dad," Finn said, his voice tight. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed not on his father, but on the merchant. "Perhaps we should wait. I heard from the blacksmith in Killarney that there's a bad batch of steel going around, blades that look fine but shatter on the first thick stalk." The merchant's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The oily feeling of deceit recoiled, replaced by a flash of startled anger, quickly suppressed. "Nonsense, boy!" O'Rourke boomed too loudly. "This is the finest Swedish steel. I'd not cheat a good man like your father." But the doubt was planted. Liam, looking from his son's intense face to the merchant's suddenly too hearty expression, hesitated. "The boy's right to be cautious," he said slowly. "I'll think on it, O'Rourke. No purchase today." The merchant left in a huff, the air around him vibrating with thwarted greed. Liam looked at Finn, a long, searching look. "How did you know that, son? About the steel?" Finn's mind raced. He could not explain the heart reading. I just had a feeling," he stammered. "The way he was talking, it felt wrong." Liam continued to look at him, his own emotions a complex mix of paternal pride and deep, unsettled confusion. He nodded slowly. "A good feeling to have," he said finally, but his eyes held a question they could not voice.
The incident left Finn profoundly shaken. He had used the Puca's gift to protect his family, and it had felt right. But it was a power that isolated him further. He was privy to the hidden landscapes of the human heart, to the secret fears of his father, the lonely grief of a neighbor, the deceit of a merchant. It was a burdensome knowledge. To know what others felt without their permission was a form of trespass. That evening, he went to the clearing and simply stood, sending out a silent, desperate thought into the twilight. Why? Why show me this? The answer came not as a vision, but as an understanding that blossomed within him, gentle as an unfolding fern. The Puca, in all its shapes, was a creature of truth. A horse was truly a horse, a goat truly a goat. Its mischief often revealed the hidden flaws in men, the arrogance, the greed, the cruelty. This heart reading was the next step. It was the ultimate truth-seeking. To see past the masks people wore, to the true creature beneath. It was not a gift for spying, but for understanding, for compassion, and for protection. He looked down at his own hands. They were the hands of a boy, but they now held a power that felt both ancient and immense. He could see the hidden storms in men's souls. And as he stood there, he felt a new, more terrifying sensation begin to brush against the edges of his perception, a cold, rigid, and utterly unyielding certainty. It was a sensation that smelled of incense and old parchment, and it was focused with a frightening intensity on him. Father Brennan's heart was a locked room, but the sheer force of his suspicion was a battering ram against Finn's newfound senses. The heart reader had been seen, and the hunter had sensed the gaze. The siege of the hearth. The heart reading was a bell that could not be unrung. Finn now moved through the village like a man walking through a field of invisible emotional landmines. He felt the simmering resentment of a farmer who felt cheated on a land deal, the quiet despair of a mother whose child was sickly, the furtive, guilty thrill of a young man meeting a lover he shouldn't. It was a cacophony of hidden lives, and it was exhausting. But one sensation began to eclipse all others, a cold, focused pressure that seemed to be tightening around his own home, around his family. It was Father Brennan's gaze, not with his eyes, but with his will. Finn could feel it as a persistent psychic chill, a sensation of being meticulously examined under a lens of doctrinal purity. The priest's heart was a fortress of unwavering certainty, and its walls were too high and too thick for Finn's nascent ability to penetrate. But the intention emanating from that fortress was clear as ice, a resolve to purge, to cleanse, to burn away the irregular, the wild, the unexplained. The siege began not with a mob and torches, but with quiet, bureaucratic precision. It started with the tithe. Father Brennan announced that the parish's contribution to the church, traditionally a tenth of one's grain or livestock, was now to be calculated differently. It would include a valuation of the land itself, its potential yield, a new and confusing calculation that fell heavily on those with larger, though less fertile, upland pastures, like Liam. Then came the visit from the church warden, a dour man named Mr. Flynn who had suddenly found fervor under the new priest. He stood in their cottage, his hat in his hands, his eyes avoiding theirs as he spoke. "A matter of concern, Liam," Flynn began, his voice oily with false regret. "There's talk about your boy." Liam's back straightened. What talk? His solitary nature, his time spent in the old places. And your good mother, he nodded toward Maeve, who sat silently carding wool, her face impassive, is known for her old stories. Father Brennan is worried for the boy's soul. He fears he is being led into error. "My son's soul is his own business, and God's," Liam said, his voice low and dangerous. "And my mother's stories harm no one." "Do they not?" Flynn's gaze swept the room, lingering on the herbs drying from the rafters, the carved stone Finn had foolishly left on the mantel. "They keep alive beliefs that are contrary to Holy Scripture. In these times, Liam, with a new shepherd guiding the flock, it is best to be conventional, to avoid giving scandal." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. To be unconventional was to be suspect. To be suspect was to be punished. The social isolation deepened. At the village well, the women who had once gossiped freely with Bridget now fell silent when she approached, offering tight, nervous smiles before hurrying away. The men who had once shared a pint with Liam at the tavern now found reasons to be elsewhere. They were not being shunned out of malice. Finn could feel it. They were being avoided out of fear. Association with the family that harbored the Puca-touched boy and his pagan grandmother was becoming socially dangerous. The most painful blow came from a direction Finn had not expected. His few childhood friends, the boys he had fished and played hurley with, now crossed the lane to avoid him. He felt their emotions as a confused swirl of fear, parental warning, and a budding, cruel curiosity. He was no longer just Finn. He was a story, a cautionary tale, and they did not know how to speak to a character from a legend. One evening, Donald and his cohorts found him mending a fence alone. "No shadowy friend to help you with your work, Finn," Donald sneered, his emotional state a ugly cocktail of bravado and a deeper, more unsettling fear. "No magical beast to do your chores for you." Finn kept his head down, focusing on twisting the wire. He could feel their collective anxiety, a sharp, metallic taste in his mind. They were afraid of him. They were afraid of what he represented. "My father says your family is cursed," Podrick said. "Says the Puca has marked your land. Says nothing will grow there soon." The words were meant to wound, and they did. But beneath the taunt, Finn felt the genuine, superstitious terror that fueled it.
Father Brennan's campaign was working. He was not just condemning a creature, he was making the land itself and those who loved it seem diseased. He returned home to a cottage that felt smaller, its walls pressing in. The hearth fire, the symbol of warmth and safety, seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the cold seeping in from the outside world. His mother's smile was strained. His father's silence was heavier, filled with a helpless anger. Only Maeve seemed unperturbed, her calm a deep, still pool in the turbulent water.
"They are afraid," she said to Finn that night as they sat by the fire after his parents had gone to bed. "Fear is a poison. It makes good people do cruel things. It makes them small. They are trying to make us small too, to shrink our world until there is no room in it for mystery." "What do we do?" Finn asked, the weight of the siege feeling immense on his young shoulders. "We do not shrink," she said, her voice firm. "We tend our fire. We care for our animals. We live our lives. We remember the covenant. To yield to their fear is to betray the trust the wild has placed in us. The hearth must stand, not us a fortress against the world, but us a beacon that the world has not yet entirely swallowed the dark." She looked into the flames, her old eyes reflecting the unwavering light. "The Puca chose you because your heart is strong enough to hold both the hearth and the wild. It is a heavy burden, Astorine, but it is your burden. Do not let them make you ashamed of it." Her words were a balm. The siege continued. The cold pressure from the priest did not abate. The isolation did not break. But inside the cottage, the fire burned a little brighter. They would not be made small. They would tend their hearth, and they would wait. For in a war of attrition between fear and wonder, the side with the deeper roots would, in the end, endure. The Council of Stone and Sorrow. The siege was a slow, cold poison, but the land itself began to rebel. The rain, which had been a soft mist, turned into a relentless, gray deluge that flooded the lower fields and turned the lanes into quagmires. The river, usually a sparkling companion, swelled into a roaring brown torrent that threatened the lower bridges. It was as if the very earth was weeping for the conflict upon it. In the village, the fear curdled into something darker, more potent. Misfortune, once random, now needed a cause, and Father Brennan was there to provide one. He called a meeting in the church. It was not a Sunday service, but a gathering of the men of the parish, a solemn, urgent convocation. The air inside was frigid, the stone walls sweating with damp. The faces of the farmers and fishermen were etched with worry about the weather, their crops, their fragile livelihoods. They stood in a huddle, their hats in their hands, their shoulders hunched against the weight of the unknown. Father Brennan stood before them, not on the pulpit, but on the altar steps, bringing himself to their level.
His face was a mask of grave concern. "My brothers," he began, his voice echoing in the vaulted space, "we are being tested. The heavens have opened, not with life-giving rain, but with a flood that threatens to wash away our labors. The river, which gives us fish, now seeks to take our homes. We must ask ourselves, why?" He let the question hang, his pale eyes moving from one anxious face to another. "Is God punishing us?" a man near the front whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "No," Father Brennan said, his tone softening with a feigned pastoral kindness. God tests those he loves, but he also gives us the wisdom to see the source of our tribulations. He allows darkness to fester so that we might have the courage to cast it out. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, ensuring he had every man's attention. There is a canker among us, a blight upon the land. We have tolerated the old ways for too long. We have turned a blind eye to the whispers of paganism, to the secret veneration of things not of God's creation. And now that tolerance has borne bitter fruit. He took a step forward, his voice hardening. The creature you call the Puca is no mere folk tale. It is a real, a malignant spirit, a demon of the wild places that feeds on our fear and our superstition. And it has an anchor here, a foothold in this very parish. It has bewitched a soul, clouded a mind, and turned a heart away from the light of Christ. And so long as that foothold remains, so long as this corruption is sheltered, the land itself will rebel. The rains will not cease, the river will not recede. We are not being punished by God, brothers. We are being assailed by the devil, and we are doing nothing to stop it. A murmur of dread and dawning understanding rippled through the men. Finn, who had been ordered by his father to stay away, could feel the shift from where he stood hidden in the churchyard, peering through a crack in the door. He felt the collective fear of the men congeal into a single pointed weapon. The heart reading was a curse in this moment. He was assaulted by their terror, their desperate need for a simple solution, their growing conviction that the priest was right. "What must we do, Father?" asked Mr. Flynn, the church warden, his voice ringing with zeal. "We must purify," Father Brennan declared, his fist striking his palm. "We must show God we are serious in our faith. We will root out the symbols of the old darkness.
We will cleanse the places where it is worshipped." A plan was formed, there in the cold, damp church. It was a desperate, fearful plan, born of a need to control the uncontrollable. They would not confront the Puca directly. Such a thing was unthinkable. Instead, they would attack its memory, its legacy. They would go to the Ring of Brawn. "The old stones," the priest proclaimed, "they are a monument to idolatry, a beacon for the dark things of the world. We will topple them. We will break their power. We will sanctify that hill with prayer and with righteous labor, and we will show this demon that its time here is ended." A grim resolve settled over the men. It was a tangible thing, a decision to commit violence against history, against the land itself, in the name of safety. They would gather sledges, levers, and ropes. They would go at first light. Finn stumbled back from the church, his stomach churning. The vision from the stones flooded back to him, the monks toppling the monolith, the sound of profound wrongness, the spiritual pain. It was going to happen again. The library of the Puca's memories was going to be destroyed. The covenant was going to be broken, not by a subtle social siege, but by a sledgehammer. He ran home, bursting into the cottage, his words tumbling out in a frantic, gasping rush. He told them everything, the meeting, the plan, the righteous fury in the priest's eyes. Liam's face went pale, then flushed with a deep, angry red. "They cannot. It is
It is an old place, a sacred place. It is sacred to the wrong god, Liam, Bridget said, her voice trembling. They will see it as their duty. It is madness, Maeve said, her voice the only calm one in the room, to fight the rain by breaking stones. It is like trying to stop the tide by shouting at the moon. She looked at Finn, her eyes holding his. The Puca will know. It will feel the violation. The land will feel it. This will not end with toppled stones. The decision hung in the air. To interfere was to openly declare themselves enemies of the new order. To do nothing was to watch a part of their world, a part of Finn's soul, be shattered. Liam stood up, his decision made. He walked to the door and took his heaviest woolen brat from its peg. I will not raise a hand to another man on that hill, he said, his voice low and firm. But I will be there. I will stand and I will watch, and they will have to look into my face while they swing their hammers.
They will know that not everyone in this parish has lost their mind to fear. It was an act of profound courage, a silent, stubborn defiance. The siege of the hearth was over. The battle for the soul of the land was beginning, and Liam was marching out to meet it, not with a weapon, but with a witness. Finn looked at his father, and for the first time he saw not just a farmer, but a king. The breaking. Dawn did not break so much as it seeped into a world saturated with grief. A thick, wet fog clung to the hills, muting the world to shades of gray and green. It was a shroud, a funeral pall for what was to come. Finn walked beside his father, the silence between them a heavy, shared dread. Liam carried no tool, only his presence, a living protest. Behind them, from the direction of the village, came the grim, metallic sounds of purpose, the clank of sledges and chains, the determined murmur of men whose fear had been forged into a weapon. They reached the ring of brawn as the first of the mob arrived. The standing stones loomed out of the fog like the ghosts of giants, their mossy surfaces weeping with condensation. They had stood for millennia, witnessing the slow turn of ages, and now they faced a handful of frightened men with iron tools. The contrast was both pathetic and terrifying. Father Brennan stood at the edge of the circle, a black stain against the gray. He held a crucifix aloft, his voice cutting through the muffled air as he recited prayers in Latin, the words sharp and foreign against the soft, ancient silence of the place. He was not blessing the circle. He was exorcising it. "See how the mist defiles this place," he cried, turning to the men. "It is a spiritual fog, a clinging darkness. Let us bring the light of God to this hilltop. Begin with the leaning stone, the one that looks ready to fall. We shall help it on its way to oblivion." The men, a group of about 15, moved forward with a nervous energy. Mr. Flynn and Donald's father took the lead, positioning a heavy sledgehammer. The first blow rang out, a sharp, ugly crack that made Finn flinch as if struck himself. It was not the sound of stone breaking. It was the sound of a bone snapping, the world's bone. Liam took a step forward, planting his feet at the edge of the circle. He said nothing. He simply stood, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stony disapproval. His presence was a silent accusation, and some of the men could not meet his gaze.
their swings becoming hesitant, their faces flushed with shame. But Father Brennan's will was a goad. "Do not falter. You are soldiers of the Lord. Strike harder." Another blow landed. A large flake of granite sheared away from the leaning stone, revealing the pale, raw rock beneath. The sound was a wound. Finn felt a corresponding jolt of pain, a psychic shockwave that radiated from the circle. It was the Puca's pain, the land's pain. He could feel its rage and its sorrow, a vast, stormy sea of emotion that threatened to drown him. Then the world reacted. The wind, which had been still, rose in a sudden furious gust, tearing at the men's clothes and snatching the breath from their lungs. It was not a natural wind. It carried a voice, a low, guttural roar of pure anguish. The fog swirled, coalescing into shapes: a charging boar, a swooping hawk, a galloping horse, that dissolved as soon as they were seen, phantoms of the hill's wounded spirit. A sense of panic began to spread among the men. Their righteous certainty was being eroded by primal fear. "Pay it no mind!" Father Brennan shrieked, his faith a flimsy shield against the raw power he was provoking. "It is a final trick, a last gasp. Break the stone and its power is broken." Encouraged, Flynn raised the sledgehammer for a decisive blow, aimed at the stone's weakened base. It was then that the Puca arrived. It did not emerge from the fog. It was the fog. It flowed into the circle from all sides, a darkness deeper than the morning's gloom, a living shadow that drank the scant light. It had no single form. One moment it was a bear, massive and roaring. The next, a writhing mass of serpents. Then a man-shaped void with eyes of burning amber. It was every story, every fear, every ounce of the wild's untamed heart given form and focused into a single terrifying point of rage. The men screamed, dropping their tools, stumbling back. The Puca ignored them. Its entire being was focused on the man with the sledgehammer. It flowed toward Mr. Flynn. Finn watched, his heart frozen. This was not the helpful otter, the grateful hare. This was the Puca of legend, the malicious trickster, the wrath of the forgotten. It was going to kill him. The covenant of cobwebs and comfrey was shattered, replaced by the law of tooth and claw. The creature loomed over Flynn, who was frozen in terror, the sledgehammer falling from his nerveless fingers. Its form solidified into the shape of the great black horse, but its eyes burned with a hellish light, and its teeth were bared, not in an equine whinny, but in a predator snarl. It was going to happen. The priest's prophecy of a demon would be fulfilled by his own actions. But then Finn moved. He did not think, he acted. He threw himself between the cowering churchwarden and the enraged spirit of the land. He stood before the Puca, his arms spread wide, a ridiculously small and fragile shield. "No," he cried, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't! This is not the way!" The Puca halted. The burning amber eyes, filled with a millennia of betrayal and pain, shifted from Flynn to the boy. The air crackled with withheld violence. Finn could feel its agony, the deep, rending hurt of the struck stone echoing in its soul. He felt its desire for vengeance, a righteous and terrible fire. But he also felt the memory of the hearth, the taste of the cabbage leaf, the feel of the gentle hands binding its wound, the shared silence of the ride across the moors.
He looked into those ancient, furious eyes, and he did not see a demon. He saw a friend in unimaginable pain. "You told me I was of the hearth," Finn said, his voice shaking but clear. "The hearth does not answer violence with violence. This is not protection. This is what they would do." He took a step closer, his hand outstretched, not in command, but in supplication. "Please, do not become the monster he says you are." For a long, suspended moment, the Puca held its form, a statue of equine fury. The wind howled. The men behind Finn whimpered in terror. Then a change came over the creature. The hellish light in its eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound, weary sorrow. The form of the horse seemed to slump, to become less substantial. It let out a sound that was half whinny, half sigh, a sound of infinite loss. It looked at Finn one last time, and then it simply dissolved. The dark mist pulled back, flowing away from the circle, draining into the earth and the air, until nothing was left but the battered stone, the frightened men, and the boy who had stood between two worlds and begged for mercy. The siege was broken. The men fled, Father Brennan among them, his faith shaken to its core by the raw, undeniable power he had witnessed.
The battle was over. But Finn stood alone in the circle with his father. The rain began to fall again, a soft, cold rain that felt like the land's tears. They had saved a life, but they had lost something too. The trust was broken. The Puca was gone, and the silence it left behind was louder than any storm. The hollow hills. The silence that fell after the Puca's dissolution was the most profound sound Finn had ever heard. It was not an absence of noise, but a presence, a great wounded emptiness that swallowed the wind and the rain. The men had fled, their terror a palpable stain on the air, leaving only Finn and his father amidst the scarred stones. The leaning monolith stood, wounded but unbroken, a raw, pale gash weeping moisture down its ancient face. Liam placed a heavy, trembling hand on Finn's shoulder. He did not speak. No words could bridge the chasm that had just opened. He simply stood, his own worldview shattered, bearing witness to his son's impossible courage and the cataclysm it had averted. Together, they turned and walked back down the hill, the fog clinging to them like a shroud of grief. The days that followed were draped in a gray pall. The physical rain ceased, but a spiritual dampness remained, a miasma of fear and shame that hung over the village. The story of what happened on the hill was told in whispers, distorted by terror. Some said the Puca had been a demon of smoke and fire. Others said the boy had commanded it. Father Brennan, shaken and pale, retreated to the rectory, his sermons ceasing for a time. His crusade had not purified the land. It had unleashed a power that nearly killed a man. And it was a boy who had stopped it. The foundation of his authority had been cracked. But for Finn, the victory felt like a defeat. The Puca was gone, truly gone. The subtle signs he had learned to read, the particular stillness of the air, the focused attention from the shadows, were absent. The high moor was just a moor again. The old oakwood was just trees. The world had become flat, literal, and unbearably lonely. The heart-reading ability, once a confusing torrent, had dwindled to a trickle, as if its source had been cut off. The land itself had gone quiet.
He tried to go to their places. The clearing where he'd received the feather held only the memory of wonder. The granite slab where he'd first ridden the black horse was just cold, wet rock.
He left offerings, a ripe blackberry, a shiny river stone, but they remained untouched, gathering dew and then withering in the sun. The covenant was broken. The bridge was down. He had saved a man's life, but in doing so, he had sent his friend into exile. A week after the confrontation, a deep restlessness took hold of him. It was a pulling sensation, a dull ache in his bones that drew him away from the farm, not to the high moor, but deeper into the wet, low-lying glens where few people went. He followed the pull without question, his feet finding a path through bracken and bog myrtle. He walked until he came to a place he knew only from his grandmother's most cautious tales, a low, grassy mound, unnaturally symmetrical, nestled against a rocky outcrop. The entrance was a dark, narrow gap between two leaning stones, like a doorway for a creature that needed no light. This was a Seethe mound, a fairy fort, a place of the good people, who were not always good. The stories warned that these were places of timelessness, of alien music and forgetfulness. To enter was to risk being trapped for 100 years, or to emerge with your mind scoured clean of memory. But the pull he felt was emanating from that dark entrance. It was not a friendly pull, it was a desperate, magnetic tug of sorrow. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, where the Puca had gone. It had not been destroyed. It had retreated to the one place it knew it would not be followed, the one place its power could find an echo, even if that echo was from a different, older, and potentially hostile magic. It had fled to the hollow hills, to the domain of the Seethe. Finn stood before the dark opening, the damp, peaty smell of the earth mingling with a faint, sweet, and unsettling fragrance that drifted from the mound, like rotting honeysuckle and cold stone. He heard it then, not with his ears, but in the center of his soul, a low, continuous keen of pain. It was the sound the Puca had made before dissolving, drawn out into an endless, silent scream of betrayal. It was hiding in the dark, licking its wounds, and its grief was a poison seeping into the very roots of the hills. He did not dare enter. That would be madness. But he sat down on a fallen log, just outside the threshold, and he simply listened. He poured his own feelings out toward that dark entrance, not in words, but in images and sensations. The memory of the hare's trust, the joy of the wild ride, the gratitude for the otter's gift, the defiant beauty of the blue feather. He sent wave after wave of remembrance, a counterpoint to the creature's despair. He did this for hours until the light began to fade. He received no answer. The silent scream from the mound did not cease. But as he stood to leave, feeling stiff and hollow, he saw it. Lying in the moss at the very mouth of the entrance, as if it had been tossed out, was a single, dead leaf. It was brown and brittle, curled in on itself. It was the exact opposite of the vibrant blue feather. It was a message of despair, a symbol of a life withdrawing, withering, giving up. The Puca was not just gone, it was dying, not from a physical wound, but from a broken heart. The connection to the hearth, the trust it had placed in the world of men, had been its anchor. Now, cast adrift, it was fading back into the formless magic from which it had been born.
Finn picked up the dead leaf, his own heart breaking. He had stopped a murder, but he was now witnessing a suicide, and he had no idea how to stop it. The war was over, and they had all lost. The unraveling. The dead leaf was a weight in Finn's pocket, a dry, brittle shard of his own despair. He carried it with him, a tangible proof of the fading magic, a constant reminder that his victory on the hill had been a Pyrrhic one. The world continued its mundane turn, but for Finn it was a clock ticking down toward a silent, invisible end. Then the unraveling began subtly. The comfrey paste Maeve made, the same that had helped the Puca, seemed to lose its potency. A cut on his hand that should have closed in a day remained angry and red. The herbs in their garden grew spindly and pale, their scents muted. The water from the well, usually cold and clear, tasted flat, as if the vital spark within it had been extinguished. Then the land itself began to sicken. A blight, unfamiliar to the oldest farmers, touched the potato plants, leaving blackened, weeping lesions on the leaves. The sheep grew listless, their wool dull and thinning. The fish in the river were scarce. It was not a dramatic famine, not yet, but a general malaise, a slow leaching of vitality from the soil and everything that drew life from it. The people, still cowed by the event at the stone circle, whispered that it was a judgment, but they were no longer sure from which god it came. Finn felt it more acutely.
His heart reading, now a faint whisper, picked up on the land's distress. It was a low, collective ache, a song of sorrow sung by the very earth. He knew this was the consequence. The Puca was not just a creature on the land, it was a manifestation of the land. Its grief and withdrawal were causing the world to wither. The priest had been wrong about the cause, but right about the connection. By attacking the spirit, they had poisoned the source. His own spirit felt the drain. The vibrant memories of his adventures began to feel like dreams, their colors fading. The carved stone in his pocket felt inert, just a rock. The world was becoming exactly what Father Brennan had wanted it to be, a place of mere fact, without mystery, without a soul. It was a safe, sterile, and dying world. He sought out his grandmother, finding her by the hearth, her hands still, her gaze fixed on the smoldering turf. She looked older, as if the fading of the magic were aging her prematurely. "It's leaving, Gran," he said, his voice hollow. "Everything is less." Maeve nodded slowly, her milky eyes reflecting the dim fire. The stories were the lifeblood, Astorin. They were the thread that connected us to the old heart of the world. The Puca was the weaver of those threads. When we stop believing, when we break the thread, the heart slows. The world grows cold. "It's my fault," Finn whispered, the guilt a stone in his throat. "I drove it away." "No," she said, her voice firm despite its weakness. "You showed it a better way. You showed it that mercy exists in the heart of man. That is a powerful magic, Finn, a magic older than fear. The Puca is not gone because of you. It is hiding because the wound is deep. It has seen the worst of us, and it is afraid to see more." "What can we do?" he asked, desperation clawing at him. "It's dying. I felt it, and the land is dying with it." Maeve was silent for a long time. "The stories must be told," she said finally, "but not as warnings, not as secrets.
They must be told as truth, the Puca's truth. Not the monster from the sermon, but the creature who saved the lamb, the one who thanked us with a nod, the one who cried out in pain when the stone was struck. She looked at him, her gaze intense. You are the only one who knows that story, Finn, the whole story. You must become the weaver now. The responsibility was terrifying. To stand before the village, before the priest, and speak not of sin, but of a wounded, magical friend.
It would be seen as blasphemy, madness. The final straw came with the hawthorn tree. The ancient, twisted tree at the crossroads where old Nuala and others had left their small offerings for generations was found one morning with its branches blighted, its leaves curled and black. It was a place of the good people, and its sudden sickness was seen as an omen of the most dire kind. The fear in the village reached a fever pitch. They had tried to purge one evil, and now a greater one seemed to be upon them. Father Brennan emerged from his seclusion, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a renewed, desperate fire. He stood before the blighted hawthorn and declared that a final, greater exorcism was needed, that they had been too timid before. This time, they would burn it. They would burn the blight from the land. Us Finn watched the villagers gather with faggots of straw and torches. A cold clarity settled over him. They were going to burn the past. They were going to burn the last remaining thread. They were going to burn the story itself. He couldn't let them. His grandmother was right. The war was not for the land, but for the story of the land, and he was the only one left who could tell it. The unraveling had reached its end. It was time to weave again, no matter the cost. He looked at the dead hawthorn, and he knew what he had to do. He would not fight them with force. He would fight them with a story, a true story. The Boy and the Blighted Tree. A crowd, volatile with a potent mixture of fear and righteousness, gathered around the blighted hawthorn. The tree stood as a stark accusation against the gray sky, its blackened limbs like skeletal fingers pleading to a heaven that seemed to have turned its face away. Father Brennan, his pallor stark against his black robes, stood before it, a flimsy torch of pitch-soaked mag clutched in his hand. His voice, stripped of its former calculated resonance, was now a raw instrument of panic. "See the mark of corruption," he cried, his words slicing through the damp air. "It festers in our very midst. We showed mercy on the hill, and this is our reward. This blight is a contagion of the spirit, and it will spread until it consumes us all, unless we have the courage to burn it clean." The villagers, their faces pale and drawn, murmured their agreement. They were not evil people. They were terrified people, fathers and mothers who saw their children's future withering before their eyes, and the priest offered them a simple, violent solution. Mr. Flynn stood ready with a lit taper, his hand shaking, waiting for the command to ignite the faggots of straw piled around the hawthorn's gnarled trunk. Finn watched from the edge of the crowd, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The dead leaf felt like a brand in his pocket. This was it, the final unraveling. To burn this tree was to burn a page from the world's oldest book, to declare that the past held no wisdom, only disease. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of smoke and despair.
He thought of the Puca's silent scream from the hollow hill, of the land's aching sorrow. He stepped forward. Stop. The word was not loud, but it carried. It was not the shout of a boy, but the clear, firm tone of someone who has seen the other side of the hill and has returned with a truth. Every head turned. Father Brennan's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of pure animosity. "Step back, boy," the priest commanded, his voice a low growl. "Do not interfere with the Lord's work." "This is not the Lord's work," Finn said, his voice gaining strength as he walked to stand between the priest and the tree. He turned to face the crowd, his people, their faces now a sea of confusion and suspicion. "This is fear's work, and it is based on a lie." A gasp rippled through them. To challenge the priest was unthinkable. "You see a blighted tree," Finn continued, his gaze sweeping over them, meeting the eyes of the men who had swung the sledgehammers, the women who had shunned his mother. "I see a tree that is grieving. The land is sick because its heart is broken." Father Brennan took a step forward, his face contorted. "Do not listen to this pagan nonsense. He is bewitched. He speaks for the demon."
"I speak for the truth," Finn's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "The creature you call a demon came to our cottage. It did not come with fire and claws. It came us a wounded hare, trembling and afraid, with a leg torn open. It came to us for help, and we gave it. My grandmother tended its wound. My mother bound it. It slept by our hearth, and it trusted us. Is that the work of a demon?" The crowd was utterly silent, stunned. This was a story they had not heard. This did not fit the narrative of the roaring beast on the hill. "It showed its gratitude," Finn pressed on, his words pouring out now, a river that could not be dammed. "When the lamb was stuck in the ewe, it was an otter that brought the healing herb that saved them both. When I was lonely and sad, it was a fox that brought me a feather, blue like a piece of the summer sky, just to remind me that beauty still existed." He pulled the dead leaf from his pocket, holding it up for all to see. "And this is what it gives us now. This is its answer to your violence. Not more violence, but sorrow. It is hiding in the dark, dying of a broken heart, and the land is dying with it." He turned and pointed at the blighted hawthorn. "This tree is not cursed. It is mourning. It is a symbol of what we have broken. You wanted to drive out the Puca, and you have succeeded. But in doing so, you are driving the life from the soil itself. The stories are not the poison. They are the antidote. They are what connect us to this land, what remind us that we are a part of it, not its masters." He looked directly at Father Brennan, his young face set with a terrible adult resolve. "You call it a demon, but I have ridden on its back across the moors under the stars. I have felt its joy. I have seen its pain. I stood before it when it wanted to kill, and I asked it for mercy, and it listened. It chose mercy. Can you say the same?" The challenge hung in the air, absolute and devastating. The priest stood frozen, his torch held aloft, his mouth a thin, bloodless line. The crowd stared at Finn, and he could feel their hearts through his fading gift. A maelstrom of confusion, doubt, and a dawning, horrifying realization. They saw not a bewitched boy, but a storyteller. They saw the keeper of a truth they had tried to burn. No one moved to light the fire.
The wind, which had been still, picked up, sighing through the blackened branches of the hawthorn.
It sounded like a whisper of relief. Finn had not stopped them with force. He had stopped them with a story, a truer story. And in that moment, the unraveling ceased. A single, fragile thread had been respun. The future of the parish and the fate of the Puca now hung in the balance of that thread. The seed of a new story. The silence that followed Finn's words was thicker than the fog on the high moor, a tangible substance that filled the space between every person gathered around the blighted hawthorn. The pitch torch in Father Brennan's hand seemed to gutter, not from the wind, but from the collective loss of conviction in the air. The mob's righteous fury had been punctured, not by a counter-argument, but by a more compelling narrative. They had come to burn a symbol of evil, and a boy had shown them it was a symbol of grief. Finn stood his ground, his chest heaving, the dead leaf still clutched in his outstretched hand. He met the gaze of the villagers, one by one. He saw old Seamus the ferryman, his watery eyes wide with a dawning ancient recognition. He saw Nuala, the widow, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes as she looked from the dying tree to the boy who spoke for the heart of the land. He saw Donal's father, the man who had swung the sledgehammer, his face a mask of shame and confusion. The story of the wounded hare, the helpful otter, the gift of a blue feather, these were not the acts of a demon. They were the acts of a neighbor, a strange and wild neighbor, but a neighbor nonetheless. Father Brennan was the first to break. The torch dipped in his hand, its flame smoking against the damp air. His authority, built on fear and certainty, crumbled in the face of this simple, undeniable testimony of kindness. He had no scripture to refute a boy who spoke of mercy given and received. His pale eyes darted across the faces of his flock, and he saw the doubt there, the shattered faith in his leadership. This is a trick," he stammered, but the conviction was gone from his voice, replaced by a desperate, hollow note. A clever twisting of the truth. "The truth is not a thing to be twisted, Father," a new voice said, quiet but firm. It was Liam. He had arrived unnoticed at the back of the crowd, and now he stepped forward to stand beside his son. He did not look at the priest. He looked at the tree, and then at the people. "My son speaks true. The creature came to our hearth. We sheltered it. It did no harm. It only asked for help, and it gave thanks. I sallallahu alaihi wasallam it with my own eyes." He placed a hand on Finn's shoulder, a public declaration of solidarity that was more powerful than any sermon. The hearth was defending the wild. The spell of the mob was totally broken. Men lowered the faggots of straw they carried. Mr. Flynn slowly extinguished the lit taper, the small hiss of its dying flame loud in the stillness. There would be no burning today. The violence was over. But as the crowd began to disperse, shuffling away in small, silent groups, their fear transformed into a bewildered guilt. Finn knew the real work was only beginning. He had stopped the destruction, but the land was still sick. The Puca was still dying in its hollow hill. He had planted a seed of a new story, but it was a fragile thing, needing to be nurtured. He walked to the blighted hawthorn and knelt at its roots. The earth was cold and hard. He dug a small hole with his fingers, the damp soil clinging to his skin. He took the dead, brittle leaf, the Puca's message of despair, and he buried it at the base of the tree. It was not an offering. It was a promise to remember, a promise to try.
He did not know if it would make a difference. The connection felt severed, the thread cut. He stayed there for a long time, his head bowed, listening to the wind in the dead branches. He heard no answer, no whisper of life, just the same hollow silence. Yet, as he finally rose to his feet and turned for home, walking beside his father in a comfortable, wordless understanding, a subtle shift occurred. It was not in the world around him, but within him. The crushing weight of the secret was gone. It was no longer a burden he carried alone. He had spoken it aloud. He had given it to the community. It was their story now too, for better or worse. The truth was out, and it could not be put back in its box. The story of the Puca was no longer just a legend whispered by a fireside. It was a part of the village's recent history, a messy, complicated, and human story of fear, violence, mercy, and a boy's courage. The seed was planted. Whether it would grow in the blighted soil of their fear or wither away was a story yet to be told. But for the first time since the confrontation on the hill, Finn felt a flicker of something that had been long absent. Not joy, not wonder, but a quiet, stubborn hope. The vigil at the threshold. The days that followed the confrontation at the hawthorn tree were not marked by dramatic change, but by a slow, collective exhalation. The village did not suddenly embrace the old ways. The fear Father Brennan had cultivated did not vanish overnight, but the fever had broken. The frantic energy that demanded purges and burnings was spent, leaving behind a weary, shame-faced silence. The priest remained sequestered in the rectory, his power broken not by a rival, but by the quiet, unanswerable power of a story that happened to be true. Finn, however, found no peace in this newfound calm. The hollow, aching pull from the Seethe mound was a constant presence in his life, a dull toothache of the soul. He had stopped the physical violence, but the spiritual wound remained open, festering. The buried leaf at the base of the hawthorn seemed to have done nothing. The tree remained a skeleton, and the land's malaise continued. The Puca was still dying. He took to walking to the mound each day, a solitary pilgrim on a hopeless quest. He would sit on the same fallen log, the entrance to the hollow hill a dark, unblinking eye before him. He no longer tried to send elaborate images or feelings. Words, even mental ones, felt inadequate. Instead, he simply sat in a state of deep, focused remembrance. He would hold a single memory in his mind and pour all his energy into it, making it a perfect, vivid jewel to offer into the darkness. One day, it was the memory of the wild ride. He focused on the physical sensation, the wind tearing at his clothes, the powerful muscles of the black horse moving beneath him, the dizzying blur of the moonlit landscape, the pure, unadulterated joy of speed and freedom. He held the memory until he could almost feel the night air on his skin again. Another day, it was the taste of the apple the goat Puca had taken from his hand. The crisp, sweet crunch, the mingled sense of its wild musk, and the fruit's simple goodness. The feeling of trust in that moment, the bridge built between boy and ancient spirit. He offered the memories of the otter's sleek, wet fur and the life-saving comfrey leaves, the memory of the fox-kit's playful yip and the defiant blue of the feather. He offered the memory of the wounded hare's trust, the feel of its rapid heartbeat under his gentle hands. He was a librarian, reading aloud from the book of their friendship, chapter by chapter, into the silent, stony ear of the hill. He did not know if he was heard. He received no sign, no flicker of response. The dead leaf had been the last communication. The silence from the mound was absolute, a wall of solid grief.
The weather mirrored the stalemate. The unseasonal blight on the potatoes did not spread, but it did not recede. The river ran sluggish and low. The world was holding its breath. Finn's vigil was a paradox. His presence at the mound was a testament to his faith, but the lack of any result was a slow erosion of his hope. He was keeping a watch at the door of a tomb. After a week of this, as he sat in a cold, persistent drizzle, a new thought occurred to him. He had been offering the Puca memories of itself, reminders of what it had been. But what if that was the wrong approach? What if its pain was so great that it no longer recognized that creature as itself? What if it needed a reminder not of its own power, but of its connection? He shifted his focus. He stopped remembering the Puca and started remembering the hearth. He held the image of his grandmother's hands, carding wool by the fire, her voice weaving stories that gave the night its magic. He remembered the smell of his mother's baking bread, a scent of safety and unconditional love. He remembered the solid, reliable strength of his father's presence, the way he had stood in the stone circle, a silent rock against the tide of fear. He remembered the warmth of the peat fire on his face, the very essence of home and belonging. He was not calling the Puca back to its wildness. He was calling it back to the covenant. He was reminding it of the shelter it had been offered, the kindness it had been shown. He was reminding it that it had a place, not just in the wild, but in the story of a family. He was offering it a memory of the hearth and its welcome there. He sat there long after the drizzle had soaked through his brat, long after his fingers were numb with cold. He poured out the simple, profound love of his home into the dark entrance of the mound. He was no longer a boy begging a magical creature to return. He was a friend calling another friend home from the dark.
Just as the gray light began to fail, as he was about to give up and trek back through the gloom, he saw it, a flicker, not of light, but of substance. From the dark gap between the stones, a tendril of mist emerged. It was not the furious, living shadow that had confronted the mob. It was thin, wispy, and faint, the ghost of a ghost. It curled out into the damp air, hesitated, and then, for a single heart-stopping moment, it brushed against his cold, outstretched hand. The touch was colder than the rain, a sensation of infinite distance and profound weariness. But it was a touch. It was an acknowledgement. Then the wisp of mist dissolved, pulled back into the darkness of the mound. The silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of a door that had been opened just a crack. The vigil was not over, but the watch had finally been relieved. For the first time since the breaking, Finn felt a thread, fine as a spider's silk, reconnect. It was fragile, almost nothing, but it was there. The slow, green return. The wisp of mist was not a cure, but a diagnosis of life. The patient was not dead, only catatonic with grief. Finn carried the memory of that cold, spectral touch back to the hearth, a small, hard-won ember of hope in the vast cold of his worry. He did not speak of it, not even to Maeve. Some truths were too fragile for words, needing the quiet darkness of the heart to grow. His daily pilgrimages to the Seethe Mound continued, but their nature changed. The desperate, forceful projection of memories softened into a quieter, more patient practice. He went not to demand a response, but to simply be present. He would sit on his log, sometimes speaking aloud in a low murmur, telling the silent hill about the mundane events of the day,
the new lambs taking their first wobbly steps, the stubborn patch of blight that finally seemed to be retreating from a corner of the potato field, the way the light caught the river in the late afternoon. He was no longer reciting epic poetry of their past. He was sharing the humble prose of the present. He was rebuilding the bridge, plank by ordinary plank. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world began to answer. It started with the hawthorn tree. A week after Finn had buried the dead leaf at its roots, a single, tiny, green bud appeared on a blackened lower branch.
It was a defiant speck of life on a monument of death. Nuala Salal at first and crossed herself, not in fear, but in wonder. She began leaving a small, plain bowl of fresh water at its base again, a private, tentative reinstatement of the old pact. Then, the blight on the potatoes truly began to recede. The blackened lesions did not vanish, but healthy, green growth pushed up around them, containing the damage, refusing to let it spread. The plants would bear a scarred, diminished harvest, but they would bear a harvest. It was not a miracle of abundance, but a miracle of resilience. The river, too, seemed to find its voice again. The water, which had been sluggish and silent, began to whisper over the stones with a renewed energy. The trout, which had been hiding in the deep pools, were seen flickering in the shallows once more. Finn felt these changes not just with his eyes, but with his heart. The dull, constant ache of the land's distress began to lessen, replaced by a slow, thrumming pulse of recovery. The heart reading, which had faded to a whisper, returned a soft hum, a sense of the land's quiet, determined effort to heal itself. He could feel the soil drinking in the rain, the roots reaching deeper, the sun being drawn into the leaves. It was a symphony of reconstitution, and he was its most attentive audience. He saw other, more subtle signs. A fox, not the puca, but a true fox, was seen at the edge of the wood at dusk, a healthy, vibrant creature. A heron returned to its post in the river, standing in stoic patience. The world was remembering how to be itself. One evening, as he walked back from the mound, he saw a sight that made his breath catch. In the high pasture, standing silhouetted against the blood-orange sunset, was a dark horse. For a wild, soaring moment, he thought it was the puca. But as he drew closer, his hope settled into a different, warmer feeling. It was just a horse, one of their own dairy mares, in fact. But she was standing tall, her coat glossy, her head held high as she cropped the fresh green grass. For weeks, the animals had been listless. Now, this one radiated a simple, contented vitality. It was an echo, a reflection. The world was not repopulated with magic, but it was being reinfused with the spirit that magic possible. He understood then the true nature of the puca's power. It was not a god that controlled the weather and the crops. It was a tuning fork. Its presence kept the land in tune with its own wild, essential song. Its absence had caused a dissonance, a sickness. Its slow return to awareness, however tentative, was bringing the world back into harmony. He arrived home to find his mother humming as she stirred the pot over the fire. His father was mending a harness, his movements sure and calm. The oppressive weight that had filled the cottage for weeks had lifted. The hearth was warm again. Maeve looked up as he entered, a knowing smile touching her wrinkled lips. "You feel it too, don't you, Astorine?" she said softly. Finn nodded, unable to find words for the profound, quiet joy unfolding within him. It was not the explosive thrill of the wild ride. It was deeper, more rooted,
It was the joy of a seed breaking open underground, of a wound finally closing, of a friend waking from a long and troubled sleep. The puka itself had not reappeared. The mound was still silent. But its influence was seeping back into the world, a slow green return. The story was not over. The final chapter had not been written. But the narrative had irrevocably shifted from tragedy to something else. Something patient, something healing, something waiting to be born. The long, grim winter of the spirit was ending, and the first fragile shoots of a new understanding were pushing their way toward the light. The scar and the salve. The green return was not an erasure of the past, but a growing over it. The scar on the leaning stone in the ring of brawn remained, a pale, raw patch on the weathered granite, a permanent testament to the violence that had occurred there. The potato plants bore their stunted, scarred tubers. The memory of the fear, the mob, the raised sledgehammer. These things were now woven into the fabric of the parish, a dark thread in the tapestry. But the community, guided by a weary and humbled instinct, began to apply its own salve. It began with Liam. He did not make a speech. He simply went back to the stone circle, not as a protester, but as a caretaker. He gathered the scattered fragments of stone that had been chipped away and piled them respectfully at the base of the wounded monolith. It was a gesture of repair, an acknowledgement of the damage done. A few days later, Finn, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, old Seamus the ferryman there, standing in silence, his hat in his hand.
Then Nuala came, and she left not an offering for the good people, but a simple wildflower laid upon the pile of stone fragments. The circle was becoming a place of pilgrimage again, but of a new kind. It was not a place to summon magic, but to remember fallibility. It was a monument to the cost of fear. Father Brennan emerged from his seclusion a changed man. The fire of absolute certainty had been extinguished, leaving behind the ashes of doubt and the slow, painful growth of humility. He no longer preached of demons and purges. His sermons, when they resumed, were quieter, focused on themes of mercy, forgiveness, and the mystery of God's creation, which was perhaps wider and stranger than he had once believed. He never spoke of the puka again, but his silence on the matter was a louder recantation than any words could have been. One afternoon, Finn was in the village buying nails when he saw the priest. Their eyes met across the lane. Father Brennan did not look away in anger or shame. He held Finn's gaze for a long moment, and then, to Finn's astonishment, he gave a slow, slight nod. It was not a nod of friendship, but one of recognition, an acknowledgement that the boy had seen a truth the priest had been blind to. It was the closing of a circle. The true salve, however, was applied in the quiet, unspoken changes within Finn's own family. The secret was no longer a hidden, dangerous thing. It was a shared history. His mother would sometimes mention, while kneading dough, how she remembered the feel of the hare's soft fur. His father, looking out at the healthy new lambs, would grunt, "We had a bit of help with that, didn't we?" The puka had become part of their family story, a strange, wild uncle who had visited in a time of need. Maeve was the happiest Finn had ever seen her. The light had returned to her milky eyes. "The stories are breathing again, Astorin," she told him, her hands busy with her spinning. "They are not locked away in my old head anymore. They are out there, in the soil, in the way your father tends that stone. The story is alive because you gave it back to the people."
Finn himself felt the change within. The heart reading, which had once been a torrent and then a trickle, had settled into a gentle, intuitive flow. He no longer sensed the sharp, hidden pains of others unless they were very close to the surface.
Instead, he felt the general emotional weather of a place, the contented hum of his home, the cautious hope of the village, the slow, patient healing of the land. It was a gift that had been tempered, made manageable, integrated into who he was. He visited the Side mound less frequently now. The desperate need was gone. When he did go, he would simply sit and feel the silence. It was no longer a grieving silence. It was a restorative one, the silence of a great creature in a deep, healing sleep. The thread was there, strong and sure. He knew the Puca was aware, recovering, drawing strength from the land's renewal. One evening, as he sat on his log, watching the bats flit in the twilight, a realization settled over him. The Puca might never return in the way it once had. The pure, untamed joy of their first adventures belonged to a time of innocence, before the sledgehammer and the fear. That specific magic was scarred, just like the stone in the circle. But something new was being born from that scar tissue, a deeper, more resilient connection, a bond that had been tested by fire and violence and had chosen mercy. The Puca was not gone. It was integrated. It was in the green bud on the hawthorn, in the clean water of the river, in the respectful silence of the villagers at the stone circle, and in the mended understanding within his own family. He stood to leave, and as he did, he felt a familiar shift in the air, a concentration of attention. He turned back to the dark entrance of the mound. There was no mist, no form, but from the deep shadows he felt a single, clear emotion projected toward him, as crisp and deliberate as the spoken word. It was gratitude. Not the simple thanks for a meal or a healed wound, but a profound, weary, and deep gratitude. For stewardship, for keeping the story alive, for tending the hearth while the wild recovered. Finn smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He nodded toward the darkness, a gesture between equals. Then he turned and walked home, the scarred and solved land sleeping peacefully under the rising moon. The adventure was over. The work of living together had begun. The keeper of the threshold. The years turned, their passage marked not by grand events, but by the slow, patient rhythms of the land and the deepening of roots.
Finn grew from a boy into a young man, his lanky frame filling out with the hard work of the farm, the freckles across his nose fading into the weathered tan of one who spends his life under the open sky. The memory of the Puca settled into the bedrock of the parish, a foundational legend that had shifted from whispered superstition to accepted, if rarely discussed, history. The scarred stone in the circle was now just a feature of the landscape, its origin a story parents told their children to illustrate the dangers of fear and the power of compassion. Finn's world had expanded, yet his heart remained anchored to the hills of his youth. He took over more of the farm from his aging father, his hands now sure on the plow, his eye keen for the health of the sheep. He was a man of the hearth, practical and steady, but those who knew him well, his family, old Seamus, saw the other part of him. They saw the way he would pause in his work, his gaze growing distant, as if listening to a conversation only he could hear. They saw the respect with which he treated the old places, leaving a handful of oats at the clearing or a fresh wildflower by the Side mound on certain nights of the year. He had become the keeper of the threshold, the guardian of the fragile peace between the world of men and the world of the old things.
The Puca never appeared to him again in any of its grand forms. The great black horse, the shaggy goat, the powerful dog, these were memories, cherished and vivid, but confined to the past. Yet its presence was a constant, subtle companion. He would sometimes find a perfect, ripe blackberry bush in a place he had sworn was barren the day before. A ewe trapped in a thicket would be found mysteriously freed, the thorns around her parted like a curtain. On the morning of a big storm, a deadfall of branches that would have blocked the road was always cleared by the time he went to check it. These were not the dramatic gifts of before, but small, practical acts of stewardship, a silent partnership in tending their shared world. The heart reading had settled into a deep, intuitive connection with the land itself. He could feel the coming of a hard frost before the clouds gathered, sense a dryness in the soil that needed attention, feel the contentment of the cattle in a good pasture. He was not commanding the land, he was listening to it, and the land, in turn, seemed to listen to him. One crisp autumn afternoon, with the hillsides ablaze with the fire of turning bracken, a young girl from the village came running to the farm, her face pale with panic. Her little brother Aiden had gone missing. He had last been seen chasing butterflies near the old oak wood. A search party was gathered, their voices tight with the fear every parent knows. Finn joined them, but us the men fanned out, calling Aiden's name. He stood still, closing his eyes. He let the chatter of the worried men fade away and opened his senses to the land. He felt the general worry of the search party, the frantic pulse of the girl's fear, the deep, slumbering energy of the forest. And then he felt it, a tiny, bright spark of confusion and tiredness, and a flicker of something else, something ancient and watchful, guiding that spark, keeping it safe. He didn't hear a voice. He simply knew the way. "This way," he said to Liam and a few others, striking out not on the main path, but on a faint animal trail that led up toward the high, rocky crags. "Finn, that leads to the cliffs," his father said, his voice heavy with concern. "He wouldn't have gone up there." "He's there," Finn said, his certainty absolute. They followed him, their doubt palpable. The trail was difficult, overgrown, and steep, but Finn moved with an unerring confidence. He led them to the base of a granite outcrop, to the mouth of a small, shallow cave, little more than a crevice in the rock, curtained by ferns. And there, curled on a bed of dry moss, fast asleep, was Aiden. He was dirty and tear-streaked, but perfectly safe. Beside him, on a flat rock, was a cluster of dark, ripe bilberries. As Liam gathered the sleeping boy into his arms, one of the other men, Donal's father, looked at the berries, then at the secluded, impossible-to-find cave, and finally at Finn. The old fear flickered in his eyes for a moment, but then it was replaced by a dawning, humble gratitude. "How did you know?" he whispered. Finn looked not at the man, but into the deep green shadows of the forest. He saw a flicker of movement, a red fox's brush disappearing behind a tree, or perhaps just the wind in the leaves. "The land told me," he said simply. It was the truth. He was the keeper, and the land spoke to its keeper. He had not summoned the Puca. Their relationship was beyond that now. It was a symbiosis. The Puca guarded the wild, hidden heart of the land, and Finn, rooted in the hearth, was its interpreter to the world of men. He was the bridge, not a temporary crossing, but a permanent, living structure. He walked home that evening as the sun set the western sky aflame, the relieved joy of Aiden's family a warm glow at his back. He felt the contentment of the hills, the safety of the forest, the silent, watchful presence that had guided a lost child to shelter.
The magic had not vanished. It had matured. It had become quiet, woven into the daily, sacred work of caring for a place and its people. The story of the Puca was no longer an adventure. It was a legacy, and Finn was its living, breathing testament. Yes, absolutely. The story has reached its final turning point. The legacy is established, and now we must see its ultimate conclusion. Here is the penultimate chapter. The last shape. The seasons spun their eternal wheel, and Finn, the keeper of the threshold, became a fixture of the land, as permanent as the hills themselves. His hair, once a fiery thatch, was now threaded with silver like frost on autumn grass. His own children, and then their children, had heard the stories by the hearth. Stories he told not with his grandmother's ominous mystery, but with a quiet authority born of lived truth. The Puca was a beloved, if unseen, character in their family history, a guardian spirit of their particular patch of earth. The connection never faded, but it evolved. The small, helpful signs continued, the timely finding of a lost lamb, the unexpected bounty of a fruit tree, but they felt less like gifts from a separate being and more like the natural functioning of a world in which he was a trusted participant. The heart reading had mellowed into a deep, wordless communion. He and the land understood one another. It was on a day of exceptional clarity, the kind that comes only after a cleansing rain, that he felt the summons. It was not a pull or an ache, but a simple, clear knowing. It was time. He took his worn walking stick, its wood smoothed by decades of his grip, and made the familiar journey up to the high moor. He moved slower now, his bones protesting the steep incline, but his step was sure. He did not go to the Seethe mound, nor to the clearing, nor the ring of brawn. He went to the first place, the granite slab where, a lifetime ago, a terrified boy had mounted a black horse and flown into the night. He sat, the sun warm on his lined face, and looked out over the valley he had spent his life tending. He could see the roof of his cottage, the stone walls of his fields, the river like a silver ribbon. It was a good life, a full life. The air began to change. The birdsong did not cease, but it became a chorus, a deliberate, beautiful music. The light took on a golden, honeyed quality, thick and substantial. And then the Puca came. It did not step out of the shadows. It condensed from the sunlight and the air, a form pulling itself together from the essence of the place. And it chose a shape he had never seen it wear before. It was an old man, old as the mountains. His form was lean and wiry, his skin like weathered leather, his long hair and beard the color of fresh fallen snow. He was dressed in simple robes of gray and green that seemed woven from moss and mist. But his eyes were the same luminous, intelligent amber, holding the same ancient knowledge, now tempered with an immense, weary kindness. There was no fear in Finn's heart, only a profound sense of completion. This was the last shape, the truest shape. The old man, the Puca, sat beside him on the rock, his movements fluid and silent. For a long time they sat together in a comfortable silence, two old friends watching the world they had saved. The thread is thin, the voice spoke in Finn's mind. But it was not a rustle or a grind of stone. It was the sound of wind over a peaceful sea, gentle and vast. The hearth remembers, but the world forgets. The new stories are made of wire and noise.
There is less room for my kind of quiet." Finn nodded. He knew. The world was changing, speeding up, turning its gaze away from the hidden hearts of hills. "I have waited," the Puca continued, its amber gaze resting on Finn. "I have waited for my keeper to be ready. The land is healthy, the balance is restored. My work here is done." "What will you do?" Finn asked aloud, his own voice a dry whisper in the golden air.
"Sleep," came the reply, filled with a sense of deep, earned peace. Not a hiding sleep, a long, dreaming sleep. "I will return to the land, not as its guardian, but as its memory. I will become the whisper in the stone, the patience in the root, the old magic sleeping under the soil, waiting." The Puca looked out over the valley, and Finn felt a wave of its love for the place, for every blade of grass, every creature, every stone. It was a farewell. But a story must have a teller. The voice resonated within him. "You have been a good keeper, Finn of the Hearth, the best of keepers. The bridge must remain." The Puca turned its gaze fully upon him, and Finn felt a final immense transfer of energy. It was not a power, but a purpose, a sacred duty. It was the full weight of the legacy, passed on. "When you are gone," the Puca said, its form beginning to gently dissipate, becoming translucent in the sunlight, "you will not leave. You will stand watch with me. You will be the memory in the stone. We will dream the same dream, you and I." It was not a threat, but the greatest honor imaginable, a permanent covenant. Finn felt no sorrow, only a rightness that settled into the very marrow of his bones. He smiled. "I will stand watch," he whispered. The Puca, in its form of the old man, returned the smile, a gesture of infinite gentleness and understanding. Then it dissolved completely. It did not fade into shadow, but into light, becoming one with the sunbeams, the air, the very substance of the hill. Finn sat for a long time, alone on the granite slab, filled with a peace so profound it felt like a different element. He was now the sole living keeper of the waking magic, but he also knew, with a certainty that comforted his aging heart, that he would never truly be alone again. When his time came, his watch would merely change its form. He was part of the story forever. He stood, slowly, and made his way down the hill for the last time, ready to live out his days until the dream called him home.